Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Fort Ord Reuse Authority regular meeting for Friday, May 11th, 2018. Pledge of Allegiance. If Congressman Panetta would lead us, please.
Pay attention if necessary. Place your hand on your heart. Repeat after me. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, sir. Okay, acknowledgments, announcements, and correspondence.
Yes, Chair. Thank you for the intro. I do have a few announcements for everyone's attention. First, I know the county representatives are proud of the fact that we are moving ahead with the East Garrison Fire Station number 7, and the Firehouse open house will be on Monday, May 21st from 10 o'clock in the morning until 1 p.m. The actual ceremony starts at 10:30. Second, I know that everyone is anxious to appropriately honor those that have served the country on Memorial Day, and the California Central Coast Veterans Cemetery is having its first annual Memorial Day ceremony. It will be 8 a.m. in the morning. Thanks for sending that note along to us, Bill Collins from the Army and others. We appreciate it. We also want the board members to be aware that on June the 8th, we not only have a board meeting, but the executive committee has made a decision to use that same scheduled day for a transition workshop / study session to talk about the items associated with the transition. And so we were anticipating that both board members and maybe even invite some alternatives to be part of the participants in the audience that day would be a good idea. And then finally, another open house that we wanted to make sure you're aware of happens to be the same day, and that's going to be the Veterans Transition Center. And the actual time of that open house we will send to all the board members as soon as the VTC nails that down. Chair, that's all I have under announcements, acknowledgments, and correspondence.
Very good. Thank you. At this time, we'll have roll call.
Okay. Supervisor Parker?
Here.
Supervisor Phillips?
Here.
Supervisor Adams?
Here.
Mayor Edelin?
Here.
Councilmember Amadeo? Councilmember Hoffa?
Here.
Councilmember Morton? Mayor Rubio?
Here.
Councilmember Alexander?
Here.
Mayor Carbone?
Here.
Mayor Gunter?
Here.
Councilmember Garfield?
Here.
Councilmember Reimers?
Here.
Congressman Panetta?
Here.
Senator Monning? Assemblymember Stone? Debbie Hale? Dr. Diffenbaugh?
Here.
Steve Matarazzo? Dr. Ochoa? Colonel Brown? Bill Collins?
Here.
Dr. Tribely?
Here.
Lisa Reinheimer? Dr. Moore? You have a quorum.
Thank you. The next agenda item is our 2018 legislative session, and would you care to introduce?
Yes, Chair, the legislative session is conducted by this board every year to get updates from our legislative representatives, that being the 3 that are members of the Fort Ord Reuse Authority Board and the 2 who also represent areas that are within the 3-county area that the Fort Ord Recovery Program serves. Today we have Assemblymember Ana Caballero and Congressman Jimmy Panetta, and representatives from the other offices are going to be here as well. First, we will have Assemblymember Caballero, and I want to, by way of introduction, point out the fact that this is the Assemblymember's multiple different roles that she's participated in the Fort Ord recovery. Anna was active in the Salinas when Fort Ord was shut down years ago. She became mayor, became a representative from the city of Salinas on this board, then went on to the Assembly, and then served on this board as Assembly member, one of the board members. And then as secretary, overseeing the General Services Administration and others in the state of California, she supported multiple efforts here, including moving the Veterans Cemetery forward and getting that property transfer underway. All of those were very successful efforts and helped us to get the recovery program underway. Now, as an Assembly member, she has been sponsoring bills that have indirectly and directly benefited the Fort Ord Reuse Authority. I give you Ana Caballero.
Thank you very much. Well, it's good to be back. See some familiar faces that have been around at least as long as I have, so it's always good to be back. I understand you want me to take about 30 minutes to go through. Yeah, that's what I thought. So let me just jump right in and talk kind of in general categories. You know, part of being involved in politics is really understanding what constituents are concerned about and what's at the top of their mind at any particular point in time. And because I spent 5 years working for the governor, I was spending 5 days a week in Sacramento and really felt like I needed to come back and talk to real people and find out what they were concerned about. And it was really interesting. I did a coffee in every single city, send out, and my apologies to Dr. Ochoa, he already heard parts of this earlier today, but you send out a couple thousand invitations, and if 20 people show up, that's pretty good. And we got some really active, this was 2016, very active participation. Every coffee was attended by about 50 or 60 people, and people were very engaged. The discussions were illuminating for me, because what I heard, and you know that there's a real difference between the people and the work that's done in the Salinas Valley and the people and the work in the economy on the peninsula. And one of the things that I heard overwhelmingly, whether I was in Gilroy or Morgan Hill or King City or Hollister, is that people in rural California feel like rural California is falling further and further behind the rest of the states. The salaries are less, so the economic opportunities are less. Housing is extremely expensive, and because of the push from the more urbanized areas into rural California, the competition is very intense for affordable housing, and ultimately the unemployment rates are higher in rural California. We're blessed because right now we have some of the lowest unemployment rates in the state since the 1940s. We have a economy that is now the 5th largest economy in the world. We just surpassed the UK. And we have a $6 billion budget. It's estimated $6 billion budget surplus this year, which is a good thing to have. So let me just say that one of the things we're doing at the state in terms of the budget is trying to be very conservative in terms of spending, or very prudent, let's use that word, it's a better word. Very prudent in terms of spending, because we're overdue for the next downturn in the economy. It's usually every 8 years, and it's been 8 years since the last downturn. And so we're looking to put as much money into reserves so that if and when that downturn comes, we have enough money in reserves to be able to tide us over, so we don't have to make the cuts that have historically been the cuts that all of us don't want to see. So that was a side comment to where the state budget is right now. The governor just released this morning his May revise, and I haven't had a chance to look at it, but my guess is it's still as wise in terms of its expenditure of money, and we'll be working on it, and I'll have more information later. But what I heard was, number one, was that people felt that we're falling behind, in particular around the area of affordable housing, affordable health care, and jobs. And so those are the kinds of things that I've really been spending a lot of time on, is looking at ways to put money back into people's pockets, make sure that our health care services are available for as many people as possible. But in particular, it doesn't do you a lot of good to get Medicare or Medi-Cal if no one takes it. We have to make sure that we have the workforce that will actually take it, and that the programs are robust enough so that there are services available for people that desperately need it. Immigration is on the top of everybody's mind. Obviously, concerned about breaking up families and the impact that federal actions have on DACA students and workers who have been promised that if they came in and signed up, that they'd be able to work and to stay in this country and not be deported, and now are worried that, in fact, now that the government has all their information, that they might be deported faster than anybody else. And so those are the issues that have been of concern, and the question that I've tried to answer as I've gone around the district in my job as the 30th Assembly District, and then also as a candidate for the Senate District, is to have a real frank discussion about what is rural California going to look like in 10 years and in 15 years. What are the jobs going to be? What are the opportunities? And how are we going to make sure that that people feel like there is not two Californias, and that we prioritize agriculture and maintaining agriculture as one of the industries in our state, because of the regulatory structure in California, people that are working in agriculture feel pretty strongly that they're inadvertently or purposefully being driven out of the state. And the only way, I mean, my analysis is if we don't do this right, we will drive agriculture out of the state. And the idea that our land will stay in open space is a fantasy. The reality of the situation is most of it will be developed because of the constitutional right to own that property and to do something with it. It will end up being like the Silicon Valley. The Salinas Valley, like that, could end up becoming the Silicon Valley. So I'm really committed to looking at what are we going to need to do. And so part of what I'm working on is a California Farm Bill that looks at 3 important issues. And I'm doing work with tax credits for poor people so they can get some of their money back that they've earned, working at trying to reduce the regulatory oversight of affordable housing so that we can get some of that built much more quickly. And I've also worked at trying to provide opportunities for professionals, healthcare professionals, to come to rural California and get their tuition paid. A tuition reimbursement paid, so that there's an incentive for mental health and public health people to come and work in our communities. But the big piece that I'm working on is looking at the importance of broadband access for rural California, because if you've driven around and tried to get internet access, you realize that there are huge areas where that's not available, which means that on-farm mechanization doesn't work because you can't deploy that without having the internet broadband access. Number 2 is training the workforce so that as this broadband access gets deployed, we have the certificated and trained workforce that can do the welding of the machines, that can maintain the machines, and that can read the apps and determine when you need to water and when you need to apply soil amendments, because that is coming and it's being developed kind of as we speak. And if we don't have the workforce trained for that, we'll be importing workforce from other countries that do produce the high level of technical skills that's required by that kind of work. And then finally, looking at the opportunity to create at the state a council that can look at some of the regulatory issues and to try to streamline them in a way so that if you create data, you create it in the same method for a multitude of different agencies. You can do it electronically, which helps with the record keeping and the obligations that are going to be required for the use of either groundwater or any other kinds of soil amendments that you're adding. And so the idea is to look at it holistically and try to figure out a way how to make it easier so that we're really creating an opportunity for agriculture in rural communities to be successful and to have the good jobs that people want, and that will keep us all focused on what's good about living in rural California, particularly since all of the data shows that agriculture produces less greenhouse gases, 58-1. An urban acre creates 58 times more greenhouse gases than agriculture, and agriculture actually pulls out greenhouse gases with the planting of trees and vineyards. And so there's a lot of good information about the benefits of agriculture to our state, including the flyways, the migratory flyways that provide the waterways and open space, as well as the wildlife habitat. And so all of those are the things we all love about rural California, and if we keep agriculture strong, I think we'll be able to have a strong economy for rural California as well. So that's in a snapshot what I'm working on, and there's a whole bunch of budget things that are going on, but that's pretty much it. I can answer any questions later if you'd like that. So thank you.
Okay, we'll hold questions until everybody's done.
Okay.
Okay.
Sure. If I may, Chair,
Yes, please.
our next speaker is another legislator that probably needs very little introduction amongst this crew. But I would like to say a couple of things. First of all, Congressman Panetta has been in service of this region for quite a while in multiple different roles. He's been as a former assistant DA. He's also had a very decorated military career that has served the region as well. We all know that Congressman Panetta, in a different time, led a charge to raise the funds needed to get the Veterans Cemetery up and operating, joining his colleagues from Carmel and other parts of the area. He's been very instrumental in other very successful projects we've had here at the former Fort Ord. At your table, there's an announcement here about something from the committee that Congressman Panetta sits on that talks about the possibility of getting funding here that could help for infrastructure, like roads that would link Seaside to Salinas, or dark fiber that might get the kind of networking that we would need from Castroville down to the Defense Language Institute, the Presidio Monterey, and just happen to supply the same to MPC, CSU, and the jurisdictions on the way. So Congressman Panetta's got some real dreams here, and we want to appreciate the fact that he's here to talk about those items and what's happening in D.C. Congressman.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Michael, I appreciate that introduction very much. Lots of dreams here on the Central Coast. A few nightmares I'm dealing with in Washington, D.C., but I guess that's part of it. It's been about 16 months since I've been in office, since I raised my hand and took the oath. And, I think I reported back here a few months ago, kind of giving you a legislative update about how kind of overwhelming and crazy it has been in Washington, D.C., and I hate to say that nothing has really changed at this point. It still continues to be a fire hose that each of the legislators that I work with, including myself, attempt to drink from. It's funny, I've obviously learned a lot because of the amount of information that has come at us, but I've also learned one thing, and that's about Sam Farr and his excellent sense of timing when to get out of Washington, D.C. But that's all right. As frustrating as Washington, D.C. can seem on the news, it is in person, but it's also a very fulfilling job, I must say. As I've always said, this has been the best job that I've ever had, and I look forward to continuing to do it. Because, the committees that I'm on, we actually are doing some good work, and we are doing good work together, both Democrats and Republicans. And it's also the caucuses that I'm on. I try to make sure that I'm part of bipartisan caucuses that are actually not just yelling about issues, but actually talking about issues. One of the most contentious issues, politically sensitive and policy complex, that I've dealt with in my time in Washington, D.C. has been an issue that clearly affects all of us here on the Central Coast, and that's immigration. I think as we've seen right now, we're dealing with something where, we understand how important it is, like I said, here in Monterey County, obviously on the Central Coast. It's our history, it's who we are, and it's our future. I firmly believe that, especially considering some of the topics that Assemblywoman Caballero just mentioned. But the fact is that you have other districts and you have other members who don't understand that in this nation. And you have to understand that, and you have to learn about them, and you have to learn about their constituency in order to actually have a serious conversation about this topic. And so that's what we've been doing. So much so that it's, because of the majority that's in Congress, it is going to come down to Republican leadership on this. And we've seen that in regards to the Dreamers. Obviously the most pressing issue when it comes to immigration at this point. Something that's very important. My district has over 20,000 Dreamers here on the Central Coast of California. To give you some perspective, California is #1 in Dreamers and 240,000. Texas is #2 at 120,000 Dreamers. The third state drops off all the way to Illinois at 40,000. And this district, the 20th Congressional District, has 20,000 Dreamers. So we have a lot here. It's very important to us, and we've been continuing to work on that issue. But to get back to what I was saying, you have members such as Jeff Denham and David Valadeo who are actually breaking with their leadership. Very tough to do on this issue. And they're doing that because they want to get this issue to the floor of the House of Representatives for a vote, something that hasn't been done in a long time on anything in dealing with immigration. And the way that they were able to step out there and do it, with obviously the urging and coordination of Democrats, including myself, is called a discharge petition. Now, normally when we put things on, when things get to the House floor, it has to go through leadership. Leadership gives its blessing. But unfortunately, on this issue, leadership is not touching it. So a discharge petition basically allows us to put it onto the floor without leadership, without going through committees, without going through the Rules Committee and putting it right to the members for a vote. But you have to get, in order to get this petition, you have to get a majority of the House to sign the petition. Now, right now, you're going to get 193 Democrats to sign that petition, okay? We have 17 Republicans who signed that petition. We need basically 8 more to do it. We need 8 more to do it. And right now, we haven't got that yet, but I do believe that coming up, we're going to continue to whip that vote, and we're going to hopefully get those other members who can do it. And what we would be voting on would be called this Queen of the Hill petition. It's basically putting 4 bills onto the floor to vote on. And the one that gets the most votes, over 218, that one passes the House. And I don't have time to go into each of those bills, but we believe that it's the best way to save our dreamers, not just here on the Central Coast, but throughout our country at this point. That's what we're left with. That's where we're at on immigration. Now, the second thing that I've been working on is the Farm Bill. Being on the Agriculture Committee, about 3 weeks ago, we passed the Farm Bill out of the House Agriculture Committee. Now, I thought I would say that with pride, but I can't say that, to be frank with you, because the fact is that it was, unfortunately, a very partisan vote, in the sense that all Republicans on the committee voted for it, all Democrats voted against it. And I can explain why. Because it basically, it was contentious because of the one issue that takes up the majority of the Farm Bill. So I'm opening it up to the House, to this floor, to see who knows what takes up the most percentage of the Farm Bill. Not subsidies. Exactly. Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, food stamps. 75% of the Farm Bill deals with SNAP. You need that urban vote because, you know, in order to get people to vote on commodities, you need the urban vote to make sure it all comes together. And so that's why food stamps are included on the Farm Bill. But it's a big proportion of it. And obviously you have a fight when it comes to work requirements, trainings, things of that nature. Now, I have to say, this past year we had 23 hearings, all on SNAP, 89 witnesses who all testified pretty much very positively about the current condition of SNAP. However, 2 weeks before the bill was in markup in committee, the chairman put forward this bill that basically changed SNAP and the requirements for SNAP without talking about it, without giving us any evidence upon which we can base our decision, unfortunately. And as I found, that topic is very, very sensitive. And you can't just sit there and kind of ramrod an issue like that down people's throats without actually coming to the table and talking about it. None of those witnesses that I told you about, those 89 witnesses, discussed these types of revisions to the SNAP program, unfortunately. And so, unfortunately, and I say this very disappointingly, that that bill passed out of the House Committee on Agriculture. It will then go to the floor for a vote. Again, it will be another partisan vote, I can tell you right now, in the sense that all the Republicans, some Republicans may vote against it. The Tea Partiers who don't want to spend anything on anything, they may vote against it, but for the most part, I think you're going to get all the Democrats going to vote against it as well. This can be the atmosphere, the environment that we are working in Washington, and unfortunately, this is an example of that. You know, of all committees, like the Ag Committee, which is known to be bipartisan, because it is a topic that is very important, not only Central Coast, especially when it comes to research funding for our specialty crops, that this is something that can be bipartisan. It's just unfortunate that this topic came up when it came up and made it a partisan issue. It's going to go to the Senate. We'll see what the Senate does. Hopefully they'll come to conference on it and we'll work it out, is how I see it. The chairman actually approached me the other day, just 2 days ago, the chairman, Mike Conaway from Texas, who actually introduced these changes, and that's kind of his prediction as well. It will get to the Senate, come back to the House, and hopefully we can talk about it, have a sensible, reasonable discussion about it. Now, the other committee I'm on, you did have those discussions, because this week on the House Armed Services Committee, we actually passed the National Defense Authorization Act, otherwise known as the NDAA. Basically, that is the authorization for our defense budget. What the over $700 billion in our defense budget, what it goes to. That's what we worked on. We had a 14 and a half hour hearing on Wednesday from 10 a.m. till 12:30 at night, basically talking about the bill and putting forward amendments to the bill. I think they do it like that so that other people, won't break. I actually talked to the chairman, Mac Thornberry, and he said, yeah, one time, because I asked him, how many of these have you done? He said, I've done 23 of these. Like, oh, man. And he said, the worst thing I did was when I split it. I did it in 2 days, because people start thinking of other amendments to add to it, and so it just expands and goes on and on. So I think they just keep us in a room, locked in that room for 14 and a half hours, as it was on Wednesday. But it was a good thing. It was a good thing. It was a hell of an experience, and there were actually some good things about what came out of the NDAA, including increasing our pay for our active duty military, increasing the size of our active duty military. Talking about ships, I think we have 13 new ships, continued procurements of the F-35s. We created a unified command, a sub-unified command dealing with space and everything that goes on up there. But more importantly, locally, we talked. One of my amendments was a cyber hacking program, which basically allows colleges to work with the DoD to work on their cyber defense systems. And that's going to help out here locally, especially at the Navy Postgraduate School. Another one of my amendments was making sure that the Secretary of Defense reports to Congress in regards to a close combat lethality task force. It's basically kind of a Top Gun for Special Operations Group, which is a pretty good thing. And then what you see here in this article, and I appreciate, Michael, you handing this out, we have the Defense Community Infrastructure Program. And basically what that is within the DoD Office of Economic Adjustment, this is going to provide a $100 million grant to the DoD that they can give out to state and local governments for infrastructure projects that are outside of military bases, yet military members use. So a number of projects, if you qualify, can basically get those grants, which I think is pretty impressive. Now also, which is good, I believe at this time, is that one of the things that's not in NDAA is BRAC. That one, I'm sorry to say, Bill, but that was not there, but I think it's actually a good thing. There was no discussion about that whatsoever. However, I still believe that we have to continue working together and coordinating and be prepared for when that does come up, because you still have bills like Ranking Member Adam Smith's bill dealing with military infrastructure and coordination efficiency that can come up, and that is going to basically be focused on shrinking down our military, and something that we need to be prepared for, especially here on the Monterey Peninsula, Monterey County, with our numerous military bases. And obviously, thinking of that unified, in that unified manner is something that I believe FORA does well. This is a place where we can come together and continue the important work that FORA has done as a single entity. I can tell you from what I'm hearing at the federal level, it makes it a lot easier when the DoD can coordinate with you in dealing with issues like the munitions cleanup, the habitat conservation plan, and obviously the $50 million pollution liability policy that you're dealing with as well. And obviously, I think it adds something to this area, and the fact that we can come together and discuss how we can continue to move forward on these important issues, not just in the DoD, but here locally. And so that's why it's important, I believe, for me to continue to show up to this, continue to be here, continue to listen and learn from all of you. And I can promise you that that's what I will continue to do as I serve my time as U.S. Representative for the Central Coast. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Do we want to hear from...
Assemblymember Stone is not able to be here today, but he was very actively engaged in the work on SB 50 recently that you heard from Colonel Brown at the last board meeting, and continues to help us in that regard. And Erica Parker is here along with a list of his legislative session handouts. So Erica had a few comments.
Yes, thank you. The Assembly member asked me to read a statement from him, and he sends his greetings. Thank you for the invitation to join you again for this year's legislative session. In Sacramento, we are striving to ensure the state is doing a better job of providing oversight and examining the systems we have in place to ensure they function properly. California is financially healthy after years of careful budgeting. My priorities continue to be reforming the foster care system, the state bar, and the justice system. Last year, the legislature was finally able to take action on both transportation and housing with 2 ballot measures on the November 2018 ballot. In 2017, like every year since 2013, the legislature produced a balanced budget, and we are on track to do the same this year. We have a projected $6.1 billion budget surplus. I sit on the Budget Committee for public safety related issues, and I'm focused on resources the state provides to help people who have been incarcerated successfully reintegrate into their communities, especially diversion and rehabilitation programs. I support the current budget request by Assemblymember Joan Sawyer to provide $100 million to the Youth Reinvestment Fund to ensure that young people, mostly those of color, receive trauma-informed, community-based services to help them stay out of the justice system and help them succeed. My other budget priorities include funding major reforms to the foster care placement system and restoring funding cuts made during the Great Recession to the K-12 and higher education systems. SB 1, passed by the legislature last year with my support, increases several taxes and fees to raise about $52.4 billion over 10 years in new transportation revenues and makes adjustments for inflation every year. It directs funding to be used towards deferred maintenance on the state highways and local streets and roads, and to improve the state's corridors, transit, and active transportation facilities. SB 3 was passed in 2017 with my support. It will be on the November ballot. If approved by the voters, it will create the Veterans and Affordable Housing Bond Act of 2018, authorizing the issuance of $4 billion in bonds for affordable housing programs and a veterans home ownership program. And there's a bit of a breakdown in this document of where those funds will go. Across the United States, we are in a time of hyperpartisanship, where too many people rigidly follow party lines instead of working together to solve problems. I'm proud to say that I've worked with Republicans on several major issues this year. Over the past few years, my continuum of care reform legislation to improve foster care family settings and group home placements has consistently enjoyed unanimous bipartisan support. I'm currently authoring a bill, AB 2849, with the Assembly Republican leader Brian Dahle to improve the Sierra Nevada Conservancy's ability to restore the Sierra watershed and protect local communities from the threat of wildfire. I'm also pleased to report that my bill, AB 2421, to restore monarch butterfly and other pollinator habitats in the Central Valley enjoyed strong bipartisan support coming out of its first policy committee because it helps both the environment and the agricultural industry. Housing has been a top priority of the Assembly for the last several years, but this past year we finally made progress. Our housing package provided money for local jurisdictions through the pending affordable housing bond and money raised through a new document transfer fee. We provided incentives for local jurisdictions to support the development of accessory dwelling units, infill, and meeting their regional housing needs assessment targets. This year, the Assembly Housing Committee is working to keep up the momentum on this topic. I've been working to find a way to assist mobile home residents when they are being treated unfairly or evicted under the mobile home residency law. Last year, AB 1269, the Mobile Home Residents and Senior Protection Act, was vetoed, but this year I'm in discussions with stakeholders and the governor's office to address this long-standing problem. Since September 2017, the #MeToo movement has resulted in courageous employees through California speaking up about experiencing sexual harassment and retaliation for reporting this behavior. As you are probably aware, in the past several months, 2 California legislators have resigned due to reports of harassment, and several other members and staffers are currently under investigation for both harassment and retaliation. We are now taking action to address legislative employee protections. the legislature is going through a special hearing process to determine how to set standards that apply to the Assembly and the Senate, how to ensure that victims aren't traumatized or re-victimized as they retell their story, and how to develop better institutional reporting and investigative processes. Currently, there are several bills being considered related to how employees can be better protected, how reports of harassment must be handled, and how the media can gain access to reports while still protecting victim privacy. I'm also working on several additional challenges this year, including reforming the bail system, reforming the state bar, and ensuring that the legislature is held to similar open record standards as other public agencies. Preparing for the effects of climate change and sea level rise along our coast is also a major focus, including investigating whether the state should change the current liability standard for utilities after the fires that devastated parts of California, and who should bear the cost of future fire damage. As always, I take pride in my team's commitment to provide the best possible constituent services in my district offices. We respond to every constituent. And then there's a summary of several of the Assembly members' bills included in the document as well. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank you for being here and taking time out of your schedule to be with us. And we'll take questions from the board now, recognizing that you're not going to be here the whole afternoon like we are, but we'll try to do our best to respect your time when we're asking these questions. Ms. Amadeo.
Thank you, Chair. Both you, Anna Caballero and Erica Parker, on behalf of Assemblymember Stone, mentioned low-income housing and bills that are coming forward. And I recently read an article in the Western Cities magazine through the League of California Cities. And in that article, they discussed possible redevelopment agencies coming back in some form, and they related it not just to brownfields and remodeling our downtowns, but specifically to low-income housing. And I'm wondering if that was related to the bills that you talked about, or the regulatory systems that that you're looking at changing in order to ensure that we do have the monies to do low-income housing.
No, that there is a bill that is trying to fix some of the issues in redevelopment that created the problem. The governor's been very clear that he doesn't want to talk about redevelopment. So it's a Hail Mary, because even if you get it through the legislature, I'm not sure the governor's going to sign it. But I think the whole point of the author, which is Assemblymember Chu from San Francisco, is that he wants to have the dialogue. He wants to have the discussion, because if he doesn't get it through this year, there's always next year, and he'll come back and do it all over again. There is a proposal by the mayors of the 11 largest cities in the state to take somewhere, I think it's $1.5 billion, and put it towards housing, affordable housing. There is a lot of discussion about the possibility of putting money aside specifically for that for the next year, a one-time fund. The $1 million question is, what do you do with it? If you're going to, you don't want to take it and do something. You can't build any permanent affordable housing in 1 year. You just can't. So if you're going to spend that much money, what do you really accomplish, and what are you trying to do? Actually, their proposal was fairly good. It focused on recognizing two broad groups of homeless: those that are very recently homeless and that can be rapidly rehoused because they're working, they may have family, they just, for some reason due to the economy, are now homeless for a period of time. And my understanding of that population is that this is happening repeatedly. In other words, it's different people at different times. So you want to set up a model where you can house them quickly so that they don't end up falling into the chronically homeless, because then they lose their jobs and they get ill and they end up costing a lot of services. And they decompensate if they have any mental health issues as well. And then, so setting up that rehabilitation or prevention program, and then doing something that's a little bit more substantive with the chronically homeless, which are much more difficult, because then you're having to provide wraparound services. So there's a lot of discussion going on. In addition, the $75 fee proposal, that first year, the money is slated for homeless services. And the issue there is it's multiple millions, it's hundreds of millions of dollars, is what program do you put it in so the money can go out immediately? Because if you have to create a program, it'll take a year. And so that's what we're working with. And there's a bunch of ideas, and we're not there yet. And I think that's part of the negotiation process. So there will be money for all of the communities to deal with homelessness. It's just a question of trying to figure out how you're going to deal with it. Everybody should be prepared, and we ought to be, from my perspective, we ought to be looking at this on a regional basis, and every community ought to take a little piece of the issue and start working on it. And we work on it together, and then everybody get back to their councils and the boards and get approval to work on it, because if we don't, we're going to continue to see people living in our wherever, whether it's under bridges and rivers, and it is a public health crisis apart from the moral crisis of not taking care of people who live in our community. So there will be money, and it'll be coming. The bond will be on the ballot in November, and then there will be even more resources. So be prepared to at least start discussing what your programs would look like with your boards. And really, I want to encourage and I actually want to help organize a group discussion among all of our jurisdictions so that we're all looking at doing something together.
Questions?
Congressman, if you could talk a little bit about your ongoing work to get more funding to remove the remaining munitions and explosives that will enable the transfer of the national monuments from 7,000 acres left, Eric? Yes.
Well, obviously, I work on services with the NDAA, making sure that we have discussions with the appropriate members who understand how important that is. Like, you have a number of, my roommate, Tom Swazi, is from New York, Glen Cove area, Long Island. He, he has a site that is contaminated based on the fact that there was a military base in his district. And so he and I are coordinating with other members to ensure that there is the proper funding, be it, through certain, now it, depends on where, where it can be, certain areas, but it's making sure that, be it EPA or DOD, that there is the proper funding there. But it's, as you know, Michael, well, this is an issue that you just can't let go. You have to continue to push these bureaucracies in order to highlight what is there in your district and the problem in the district. And I'm lucky to have someone like Congressman Swazi who we can actually work these issues together.
Okay. Well, if there's no other questions from the board, are there any questions from the public? Well, very good. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules. I know that you're got a lot of things to do, and but we really do appreciate the input you bring to us, the report you bring to us, and just a general feeling of cooperation and willingness to help us out here in the Central Coast. We've got a lot of issues, and you're all aware of them. You're from here, you know what we're dealing with, and we really do appreciate your representation on those issues. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move the agenda on to the consent agenda, which consists of April 13, 2018 meeting minutes, the Administrative Committee, the Veterans Issues Advisory Committee, Wastewater Oversight Committee, Transition Planning Update, Prevailing Wage Status Report, the Legislative Committee, and public correspondence to the board. Is there any item that anybody on the dais would like to pull for further consideration? Yes, ma'am.
Can I just put the minutes on next meeting?
Well, just to make a note of that. Okay. Any others?
So I have a quick question on item prevailing wage, which is F.
Is there a quick question or?
Yeah, just a couple of quick questions. It's only an information item, but
Right.
it's put forward. I wanted to know the source of the attachment A language is, where was that, what was the source of that?
Yes, Chair, members of the board, Sherry Damon, Prevailing Wage Coordinator. This language was drafted by FORA staff. It was circulated to the city attorneys for Seaside and Marina and to Santa Cruz Building Trades and union representatives and to the Department of Industrial Relations. This includes comments from the Department of Industrial Relations and from the building trades.
Okay, thank you.
All right, is there anybody in the public who wants to pull anything for further consideration? F. Anybody else? Okay, we have F pulled for further consideration. I'll entertain a motion for the remainder. So the motion is second to approve the consent agenda minus item F. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Item F. Mr. Cheshire, would you like to?
Ron Cheshire of Monterey Santa Cruz Building Construction Trades Council. Ms. Damon's job is becoming increasingly difficult. When you don't get the correct or appropriate, or you don't get the information at all, it's very hard to generate a report that really gives you a good indication of what's going on. And I don't know if it should even continue, the report itself in regards to construction. Like I said, it's not a good indication of what's taking place. Either she's not getting the information or she's getting misinformation, and I wouldn't expect anybody to try and bake a chocolate cake with a handful of mud and a handful, of flour. And that's what she's getting. The communities here, when the base was announced that it was going to close, had a hope and had a dream. And that has faded over the years. It's faded because there is really a lack of will on behalf of this board to take up its job. But I'm not going to blame you directly, because it's actually the jurisdictions that need to look at their agreements in regards to development in their own areas. They were the first line of defense. And the first two big developments that took place in the first jurisdictions, they couldn't run and hop in bed fast enough to cut some good deals and forget what was promised to the business community and to the workers of this community. Unfortunately, and there's language in your master resolution that we can sit about and argue about all day long, but if the jurisdictions don't do their job, then FORA is supposed to do its job. And again, I look to the fact that FORA should be taking on the responsibility of reminding the jurisdictions of what they're supposed to do, and if necessary, enforcing what the jurisdictions should be doing. We had a good meeting with the DIR. We've learned some things, and we have a lot of questions still in regards to what needs to be done. What I'm extremely concerned about is that we're running out of time. We're running out of time as far as the transition. But what we're looking forward to is what will take place after that transition.
Thank you, Mr. Cheshire. Is there any other comment on this item? Okay, I'll bring it back to the board. Any questions or comments? Okay, I'll entertain a motion. The motion is second to approve item F, the prevailing wage status report. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Next item is item 7A, a resolution approving the adoption of the Public Agencies Post-Employment Benefits Trust administered by Public Agency Services. This is a second vote. We've had a pretty robust discussion at the last meeting. So, Michael?
Yes, Chair. As you indicated, this is a second vote. The members of the board, some specific questions were posed about providing additional information. We've attached the Highmark Capital's historical background on the various kinds of investment portfolio options that are available, and that includes their recommended option. Again, this is one that would essentially provide us about a 2.5% return on our investment. There is about a 0.5% cost of their work that they do. This would probably give us about a 1.4% increase in our yield. I think that's correct. Helen, that's about correct? So therefore, we would make quite a bit of money on the amount of funds that we'd be investing, and therefore it would reduce, would help to pay for our obligation in 2020.
Any further questions from the board?
Thank you, Your Honor. I have, my understanding is that we are not voting on the particular investment mechanism at this point. Correct?
No.
Okay. So, but I still have a question, so if I could please put that forth for further clarification at a later date, would that be okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, it's on page 35. First of all, this does a very good job of laying out that this is no equities, fixed income portfolio, very conservative, good. And that it reduces our risks and it does everything it's supposed to do. However, on page 35 of the prospectus, the core fixed income fact sheet, it gives characteristics of the investments that have a longer investment horizon than mid-2020, even though elsewhere it says that the horizon will be mid-2020. So if you try to sell halfway through the maturity and interest rates have risen, those will be less. So I'm just wondering why it says in one place they'll be looking at a target date of mid-2020. The investments characteristics listed here on page 35 give a longer investment horizon.
We were provided that background just at the request of the board members about historically what had been the circumstance, what kind of investment portfolio, what had been their record of return. So they provided all of the information. We didn't want to leave any out, so we provided all of that. Helen?
So what, Randy, your check, the vice president of the portfolio investment, what he recommends is putting it into a 2-year fixed core program so that it will mature come June 30, 2020.
Or June 15th.
Right, I get that, and
Right.
that's very clearly stated. However, the fact sheet that's
Right.
on one of the investments has a longer portfolio
That's
horizon.
correct. They don't have a fact sheet that's just for
Okay.
2 years.
That
That's why.
explains it.
And
Thank you very
usually when
much.
they do a fact sheet, it's always projected for over 10, 20, 25 years. So that's
Okay.
why. Currently, right now, the rates for 2 years anywhere between 2%, 2.5% to about 3%.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on what the feds do, it may even go up higher. So that's why he's conservatively projecting 2.5% investment.
Just the fact that the fact sheet is a sample as opposed to an actual fact sheet is all I needed
That's
to hear.
correct.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Is there any public comment on this item? All right, I'll bring it back for a motion. There's a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. One no vote. The next item is Arcadia's pre-construction munitions-related mapping and construction support plan for preparation for the FORA CIP. Mr. Umar.
Yes, Chair, members of the board, this is Peter Said will provide you with a very, very brief PowerPoint presentation, but this is work that's required under our Land Use Covenant Implementation Plan and Operation Maintenance Plan for future projects. but it's also a requirement whenever we are doing work on Fort Ord when we have munitions and explosives work. We have that kind of work that's upcoming. There's going to be improvements and corrections that have to be done to road work. This would be the essential elements required to make that construction support plan work. We are very fortunate that we have the Arcadis folks, which have an extraordinary amount of experience here, along with Christy Reimer, who can coordinate this effort, and Peter will provide a very brief PowerPoint presentation.
Thank you very much. So essentially, we're looking at the preparation of construction support plans. As you know, our capital improvement plan requires earth disturbing activities, and there's contingencies for unexploded ordnance. There's also, the sites are clean, but there's a potential for residual munitions to be found while doing the CIP projects. And when it comes to public safety, you can never be too safe. What we're worried about is once we start digging, we find something like this. And then the question becomes, what do we do with it? And the construction support plan lets us do that. Now, the Arcadis, who is the ESCA team consultant leader, they've been doing this sort of thing for 10 years on former Fort Ord. We have a current master services agreement in place with them. They've provided us estimates. We've looked at it. Reimer Consulting has looked at it. Everything seems to be pretty much in place. So in essence, a simple scope for those who are interested is that we're looking for them to create maps and compile background data where previous fines were at, prepare utility of installation and maintenance guidelines for the jurisdictions. That's something we plan on handing off to the cities so they have their own construction support plan as they move forward. And to prepare specific support plans for things like the Eucalyptus and General Jim Moore Infiltrator Repair Project and the South Boundary Corridor. And we do need those construction support plans to get permits from DTSC, Army, EPA, and others. So part of the scope is also to provide us with estimates for on-call construction support and after-action reporting, which is stuff that happens during and after the construction. There's 2 service work orders. The first one is for the Seaside Munitions Response Area 1 to 4. This is primarily for the Eucalyptus Road Infiltrator Project, but will also be handed off to Seaside so they can do future maintenance on the roadway as they move forward with their projects or their city in the future. And then the second one is with the South Boundary Corridor. What we're looking for the board to do is authorize the executive officer to execute the work authorization with Arcadis not to exceed $73,800. Thank you.
Okay, questions for staff? Ms. Amadeo and then Ms. Morton.
My question, and maybe I don't understand how this works, but my understanding is when something is ready to be turned over for public use, that it's already got all the certification, for lack of a better word, that it's cleared and ready for construction to begin. And what I'm understanding from this is, even though that's happened, when you actually begin work, you have to have another study. Is that correct? Am I understanding this correctly?
You are. The City of Marina, in fact, has engaged what we call informally an ordinance.
Right.
It requires whenever you're moving more than 10 cubic yards of fill that you have to put together a plan for how you're going to do that whenever you're moving dirt. Mm-hmm. We know that the work that's been done here, in fact, we are probably as good as there is in the nation and maybe in the world in terms of munitions and explosives removal. And even though we often say that we're as close to 100% as possible, 99.9%, there's still that 0.1% that may have to do with the fact that we don't remove the trees. We try to keep them as much as possible, limb them up. The roots often cover or hide munitions and explosives. Sometimes when you're doing roads or when you're doing restoration work for habitat, those root balls wind up moving and you might find something in that. And so there is a construction support plan that's provided that says, here's how you're going to manage this. You're going to have somebody on the other end of the phone. Everybody who's there has to go through a special kind of training. We actually have a video now that does the training for each individual. You know about this. And then if something is encountered, you call that person, and if that person comes out, identifies it, they may have actions that occur. If that is in fact a munition that requires removal or demolition, it may be blown in place, but then we'll step out another distance and we'll check to see how that works, and then we do a specific plan for how that's addressed. So those are requirements that come with this property. All of the property in Seaside East will have that kind of requirement. Some of the CSUMB property has that requirement. Some of the MPC property has that kind of requirement. There are a few places that don't, but the ones that don't have those specific covenants have the ordinance.
Yeah.
So, Stan, correct any part of that that I overstated?
That's a very good overview.
Ms. Morton.
So my question is, this funding comes from the USCA funding, correct?
No.
This comes from our CIP?
This does come from the CIP funds, and it comes from, in the CIP, there's a line item for transportation contingency. That contingency is primarily for dealing with all the UXO surrounding the CIP projects.
Okay, so funding is from all sources of
Right.
our CIP funding sources.
So, if I could add, in this particular case, it comes, but that's
I know
because...
there's these subtleties, and I'm just trying to
Right.
have a better understanding,
Okay.
because it's referencing USCA.
Yeah, in many cases,
And
this would be the case.
Arcadis,
Yeah.
and then I'm.
Understood.
So the clarification is great.
So, where there's specific properties and specific actions that are covenanted under the Environmental Services Cooperative Agreement, in the future, when construction occurs on those sites, we have negotiated for, and Congressman Panetta helped us last year, to be able to get the funding. That's the 6.7, you got it. So that funding would cover this if that was part of that. These properties that were conveyed to Delray Oaks and to Monterey for Southbound Road occurred outside of the ESCA.
Any other questions from the board for staff? Any public comment on this item? Okay, bring it back. Is there a motion? Oh, I'm sorry.
Did it again. My name is Eric Peterson. I brought this up before. I totally fail to understand why Fort Ord Reuse Authority, for a United States Army base located inside the United States of America, continues to contract with Arcadis, which is headquartered in Amsterdam. Last I checked, Amsterdam was still in Europe. And I really think it would be appropriate to turn this down and direct FORA to a contract with an American company for work on Fort Ord. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Is there any other public comment? Okay, I don't see anybody, so bring it back for a motion.
Move approval.
There's a motion. Second. There's a second. Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. The next item is a consider adoption of the FORA fiscal year 2018-19 annual budget. Mr. Hulamart.
Yes, Chair and members of the board, I'm going to try to do my best to do a PowerPoint presentation for the annual budget, and in the event that I go off the rails, Helen will be at the other microphone to help out. The annual budget is typically presented at the May meeting. Sometimes the budget is approved then, but it typically is given as an overview in May, and then it certainly needs to be adopted by June so that by July 1st we have an up and running budget. In terms of the highlights for this year's budget, we want you to know that this was prepared in conjunction with the CIP budget. We had a couple of board members ask questions about should we do the CIP first or the budget first. We have typically done the budget in the past. By approving the budget, it does not mean you are committed to something that was in the CIP. You still have an action to take on the CIP. That's something that follows later. This typically uses the kind of projections that we have in the CIP for budgeting purposes. It doesn't mean that you're stuck with those numbers when you get to the CIP. In terms of the specific items in the budget, our fund balance at the end of FY 18-19 will be about $29 million. There's specifics about that are located on each of the individual pages, and the Finance Committee has scrubbed this with great detail. Included in this budget are salary and benefit adjustments, 3% COLA. There's a request for additional staff person. We'll talk about that when we get to that that item on the PowerPoint. There's also an additional item in here for transition costs. There's a fiscal upswing of about $500,000. Some of that is directly tied to requirements that we have in the LAFCO process. LAFCO's asked us specifically for indemnification and a set-aside for the work that will be done in the application, indemnifying them for legal action that may occur on the transition plan. We will need certain consultants as LAFCO requires CEQA and other work. We're still working with the state to see if we can find ways of exempting that. But because we are a Superfund site, a Comprehensive Environmental Response Coordination and Liability Act site, we are listed by the state and are required to do CEQA on these kinds of items. So we're working on that. There's also some items that will be included in the budget have to do with employee transition and other legal work. Next slide. So in sum, our budget looks like this. Our annual revenues are going to be about $16 million in the upcoming year. We use projections by the jurisdictions to come to those results, plus what we anticipate from franchise fees and from our membership dues. Our total expenditures are going to exceed that $16 million. Much of the $19 million you see is for work that will be done in removing of buildings in the coming year. We already have contracts underway for Surplus 2, and we anticipate construction starting in the stockade next year. So there'll be quite a bit of construction work. The CIP will describe that. So when you come to revenues, to give you a bit more detail, you see special revenue funds. They're the SRF, we call them funds, our leases and land sale, our CFD and tax and developer fees, and our Army ESCA contract. In the coming year, we expect to spend about $1 million, but I'm having revenue, I'm sorry, about $1 million. That's a projection because that's all on a reimbursement contract now. We don't get the money up front. We have to do the work and then get the reimbursement from the Army after the work's done. But as you can see, we're not projecting leases or land sales in the coming year. We don't anticipate any property sales closures, so therefore that column is empty. Our general fund monies are pretty much there listed. Some of it comes from property tax. Some come from our investments. Helen has carried on the tradition of making sure our investments do the best that they can. There may be different ways of managing that to get more, but $120,000 is not bad in terms of return on our investments. So that's a snapshot of our revenues. Next page, with respect to expenditures, as I mentioned, you can kind of see where the funds come for the expenditures, but how it's split up. Much of the money is going to be spent in capital projects next year. As I mentioned, we have several projects that we intend to be in construction. It includes roadway, it includes the repair work at Eucalyptus, it includes some of the building removal work I mentioned before. But in terms of expenditures, we come out at $35 million next year in total expenditures. Just want to note the bottom, if you probably saw the 3% COLA, we'll come back to that. Under fund balance and our reserves, the board has taken some specific policy direction with respect to what is kept in reserve. For CalPERS termination, you see in the green highlighted box below, and if that isn't green, let me know. My color blindness gets me in trouble. That's $6.7 million in CalPERS termination reserve. Under operations, the board some years ago, I think that 3 years now, started putting funds away in reserve to make sure that we had operational costs through 2020. This is what would be remaining. Under habitat management, about 30 cents on every dollar we collect from Community Facilities District goes into this habitat management reserve so that future work in habitat will have the full funding it requires. And then, as you can see, we have some reserves in CIP that add up to $232,000. And we have some unassigned reserves as well. So roughly in reserves, $29 million, and that roughly equivalent to our fund balance. Anything else, Helen, on this page? Next. The operating budget is pretty well known. About $2.5 million of our operating budget, you see the revenues come out of general fund, As you can see, quite a bit of the other money comes out of the developer fees. Our Army ESCA contract pays for the rest. So of our $16 million in revenues, it's coming out of, primarily comes out of tax and developer fee costs for the annual budget. Our expenditures are pretty clear. In terms of our salaries and budget, and look again, it's $2.5 million of that comes out of general fund leases and land sale. And Army ESCA, there's the $450,000 is out of local taxes and fees. And then supplies and services, contractual services, capital projects are all, as noted before, all scrubbed by the Finance Committee. Next. Under compensation and benefit adjustments, we did a bit of work to understand what the potential would be for the coming year. Of the $2.9 million in compensation and benefit category, that's a decrease of about $942,000 from the last year for a couple of reasons. Most of that having to do with the fact we paid off our unfunded actuarial liability, so that will not be paid this year because there isn't any to pay. We paid that off now. So we are including a request for an additional position. That position would support our archiving and transition work that is required. We have a significant amount of contracts, government contracts, agreements between jurisdictions, and other items, along with 24.5 years of records that need to be archived and put into a comprehensive package that can be provided for future jurisdictions that take over portions of our work, and how that's distributed will be in the future, but we need to have it in a usable digital format that can be transferred, and also that would be a help with our Public Records Act requests. We do get an extraordinary amount of those. Roughly that takes a 0.5 of one of our positions, so that your clerk is only spending about 0.25 of her time with board support instead of 0.5, and only 0.25 in support of the executive officer instead of 0.5. So this other position will give the board more responsiveness to handle the very heavy workload the board has coming, along with dealing with Public Records Act requests and archiving. And then the step increases are kind of an annual thing. Not everyone's eligible for a step increase. Not everyone gets a full step increase. It's based on performance. The 3% COLA is for those eligible. You have to perform, you have to be employed by FORA for a period of time before you can get a COLA. Not everyone will be eligible for that. Our health insurance benefits, we don't anticipate a change in that. And in terms of retention, the Finance Committee and others have suggested as we near the sunset, we have going to have some real issues in terms of retention, the special assignments that we will have to give folks as we lose employees. I think the recruitment for someone to work in a position for less than 2 years is going to be difficult. So we're going to have to think about maybe temp help from agencies and other kinds of things. So this would be a way of addressing that question. So again, the decrease from the prior year is quite considerably, but that's because the unfunded actuarial liability was paid off last year, will not need to be paid this year. The cost of living adjustment, the Finance Committee asked that we do some research about how we would compare with others. On the board, you see what we have done in terms of that survey with respect to what others in the area are doing. Our 3% is consistent. I think Helen looked that up, and it's actually should be 2.992. But so it's 0.008 below 3%. So the 3% cost of living adjustment is recommended. The budget impact of that 3% change is noted on the right. In terms of retention benefits, a little more detail about this. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It's really about employee retention, about coverages and special assignments. It's about a $50,000 impact. Next. That's our request.
Finance Committee have any comments you'd like to start off with? Yeah.
So just as to the Finance Committee role, I just want to make clear that the Finance Committee role did not make a recommendation as to the cost of living. the cost of living, your last statement was there was a recommendation for 3%. And my understanding at the Finance Committee was that recommendation was being made by staff, came to the Finance Committee, where we looked at whether there was sufficient funds to pay for that. But that's the sole function of the Finance Committee. So,
yes, and I thank you very much.
So who is the recommendation from?
Thank you very much for that. Yes, the Finance Committee did determine that there were sufficient funds to pay for that cost of living adjustment. All compensation issues are considered by the Executive Committee. Staff did recommend the 3% COLA. Helen did do the appropriate underlying work, and the Executive Committee reviewed that and is recommending adoption of the 3% COLA.
So the Executive Committee, thank you for that clarification. I have other questions, but
Sure,
I
go
don't
ahead.
know if you're there. So in reviewing the budget is that we are looking at this year, our budget, excluding the development fees, that we're expecting revenues of $863,990. And we reviewed this at Finance when we were looking at what were the adjustments we're making. Of that, there's an increase in our property tax of we'll call it $604,000. And the $604,000 in this budget is largely absorbed by overhead cost. I wanted to confirm that property tax is a potential source of funding for our CIP and or for blight removal, correct?
That is correct. Only 1.3 is earmarked for general funds of that property tax.
So the portion that we're spending, that increase, the increase in the budget of $863,000, of which all but $200,000 comes from property taxes, we're expending that largely on the LAFCO process. We've set aside $475,000.
500,000, yes.
Oh,
The increase over prior year was 475, but it's
I'm sorry,
500,000.
so the LAFCO is 500,000.
That's correct.
Great. And then we've increased, we have $100,000 of increase in the CIP attorney's fees. That's from that same source.
That's
funding
correct.
source. Okay. So then the 3% cost of living increase would add $125,500 to our employee salaries and benefits costs.
No, only 69,000 is due to the COLA.
Okay.
And then the other increase is due to the request for an additional staff and the reclassification.
That's 50,000. So if I add those together, you come up to the 218.
No.
So can you just tell me, what is your staffing cost
Our
currently, and then the 3% increase? And I get that there's another additional person.
So our current staffing cost is $2.7 million, roughly $2.7 million. That's what we're projecting this year. For the budget, we're proposing $2.9 million. That's a $218,000 increase. $69,000 of that is for the COLA. $100,000 is for the additional position and reclassification, and the $50,000 is for the retention benefits.
And then there was a comment made about the Finance Committee discussed, or I can't remember exactly how you phrased this, but that the Financing Committee scrubbed the budget. I got that. But you also indicated that there was a discussion about retention issues, that the Finance Committee did not vote on any retention issues, correct? And I just want to make sure your comment is not misunderstood by everybody. So we're all in agreement that we haven't made any decisions. Okay.
So there's no money put toward retention benefits?
Not in this budget.
What was the 50,000 then?
For a record retention clerk, it's a person, correct?
No. The $50,000 is a retention benefit that's included in case we have natural attrition, special projects as things go on. That's what that is.
So, well, then I misunderstood that. Okay.
So
Thank
if you
you
go
for that
back to this
clarification.
slide, you see the retention benefits. It's right there. That's not for the archiving and the documents.
Okay. But were you asking that, what is the cost of the archiving, the new person?
Yeah, the new person is how much?
The new person will be helping us with all the archiving and the,
The first line.
The new person is,
100,000.
the first line includes requests for an additional position, and that person will be responsible for helping us do all our archiving, other than the general plans.
Wait a minute. We're starting to have a dialogue here. Are you done with your questions?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Thank you for answering them.
Sure. I think Ms. Garfield had her hand up, and then Ms. Adams.
I just wanted to clarify a little bit, having been through this discussion at least a couple times in Finance Committee. That $100,000 up there in section, the increase from prior year for $218,000, the first bullet point is $100,000 in salaries and benefits. Don't forget reclassification, because we've got people working outside their scope.
Yeah.
And so the ability to shift somebody from one job to a different job because of the demands that are changing needs some flex. And while that's not committed, it's available through this budget process. If you have to work somebody outside their scope, you need to pay them for it. And so that's what that first bullet point is, including the clerk, if I'm recalling our discussions correctly.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair.
So then my
Ms. Adams.
question was just clarification. Essentially, you've responded to a part of it. So X amount for reclassification and X amount for the new staff person?
Between the
Right.
two, it's $100,000. So I'm not exactly sure the number. Essentially, the administrative assistant position, probably a total cost in the range of $75,000, $80,000, and the rest would be for reclassification.
Okay.
Something like that. I don't have the exact numbers, Helen, but
That's
that's
correct.
okay.
That's, keep in mind, that's benefits and wages. That's not just wages.
Thank you.
Full vote.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Mr. Moore.
Chair Rubio, so the summary on the budget of expenditures and revenues shows a capital projects line item of $29,701,000. First of all, a suggestion and then a question. The suggestion is, since the next item is the actual capital improvements project, whatever motion is made on the budget, you might want to make it contingent on approval of the CIP for that particular $29,000 or $29 million line item. That's number one. Now to the question. When I look in the CIP in Table 3, the summary there shows only 21 million. So I'm wondering what the explanation for 29 million versus 21 million might be.
Some of the next year's expenditures, just to take it on really quickly, Chair, if it's okay, they're carryover from this year. So we can provide that detail if you like. So 21 is in the coming year. You would find it in the CIP. Peter, if I have this correctly, about 8 million is carryover in building removal and construction that was going to happen this year that will go into next year? Okay.
So it's not shown because it's from a previous year and this summary of capital improvements doesn't show the carryovers. You might want to have a carryover column that might be helpful.
Peter?
Okay, any other questions?
His question
Ms. Adams.
is, if you look
I
at,
think I may have misunderstood what Michael just said, so let me see if I want to be sure I understand.
20
You did
million.
not imply that there was $7 million in this year's budget that could have been used for blight removal, that we chose not to, and we're simply carrying it over.
No. I'm sorry if my shorthand did that. This $7 million was approved to go for surplus 2 and other work this year. We had a couple of challenges, legal challenges that delayed the work, so much of the work will not occur in this fiscal year. The work will happen in next fiscal year, so there is a carryover of whatever that is.
So it was
So
simply
was
due
not-
to
you
legal
did not
issues
choose
that
to do
did
it.
not allow us to do it.
You did choose to do it. We did the process. In the bidding process on one of them, there were challenges that delayed the work. the work starts and wind up happening in next year's budget.
And those funds are encumbered.
Yes.
Okay. Is there any questions or comments from the public? Sneaking around. Okay. All right, bring it back to the board. Any other discussion, questions, or?
I'll make a motion, we approve the budget and the 3%.
There's a motion and a second to approve the budget as presented. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay, well, I guess we go for a second vote next month. What's the other item?
So, staff assumes that in the recommendation you were, the recommendation was for both item 1
That's
and
correct.
item 2? Okay.
That was my motion.
Okay. All right, then we'll move on to the next item, which is capital improvement program.
Yes, Chair. The previously announced and coming attraction, the capital improvement program, Peter Said will provide a full board presentation that includes a PowerPoint that gives answers a number of questions that we received over the last several days. The capital improvement program is mentioned in our state law requirements. It has been adopted. The first one was adopted almost 20 years ago. The board has acted on the capital improvement program every single year since that time. It's had a number of different adjustments. Peter will try to highlight where some significant items have happened in the last decade that affect this particular capital improvement program recommendation. And today our request is going to be that you receive this report and consider adoption, providing staff with any direction with respect to the CIP.
Thank you, Michael. I think Michael just outlined this for you very nicely, so I'm going to go ahead and just dig into the meat of it. There have been some requests that we provide a little bit more understanding as far as what has happened. Since January and May, there's been a very robust dialogue with the Administrative Committee. We've held 9 separate meetings to coordinate the FORA Capital Improvement Program. We've discussed the development, land sale, and revenue forecasts. We've dug into the transportation priorities and the impact on the Development Resource Management Plan. You're going to hear this a lot. It's referred to as the DRIMP. It is a part of the base reuse plan. We've the Administrative Committee also discussed methods of adjusting the base reuse plan and forming, and to do so, they went ahead and formed a separate CIP task force to discuss for, future issues. On March 14th of 2018, the Administrative Committee developed, confirmed those development forecasts. Those forecasts are on tables 6 and 7 of your capital improvement program. And so if you would like to look at those forecasts, each jurisdiction provided them, and they're there for your use to understand how our revenues are developed, or revenue projections, that is. So in setting the priorities, the first step, as outlined in Appendix A of the Capital Improvement Program, is that we bring together the subject matter experts for the transportation priority ranking process. This is a process that we've done. We've attempted to use an evidence-based approach. It's a standard engineering approach. And we work together with each of the jurisdictions, 5 jurisdictions, and CSUMB, the project managers, engineers, and planners from each of those jurisdictions. And we scored all the roadways per that Appendix A. And that includes the Northeast-Southwest Connector and South Boundary Road. In scoring those, we came to a consensus on 8 criteria for 20 projects. That's over 160 points of data that we were able to put together. And we had a very robust discussion about everything from the status of the CEQA of each project to the estimated construction start date of the project and the total funding and estimated need for funds at different times. This discussion really helps us set our transportation priorities and determine how to allocate funds. That is best understood on Table 2 in your capital improvement program. Table 2 has both the rankings and the allocations, and so you can get a good understanding of what is happening there. After this staff, subject matter expert staff, went ahead and did that. We brought those findings forward to the administrative committee. And what they did is they considered the underlying criteria definitions, and they considered reprioritizing. They looked at the various arguments for and against reprioritizing, and they decided to recommend the priorities as presented. Next, what happened was, did I skip? I think I skipped one. There we go. So in looking at the ongoing capital improvement program, a CIP task force met and considered the prioritizations of the program. They looked at reprioritizing the CIP. They considered the DRIMP housing caps. Remember I said I'd refer to this. This is part of the BRP. There's housing caps in there. And after a couple days of discussion, what ended up happening is they recommend that staff return to the administrative committee in June with a draft presentation exploring financing mechanisms for the removal of the remaining buildings. And I'd like to highlight that those are the remaining buildings that are not currently in the CIP and are not currently part of the FORA obligations. So this, through a very long dialogue of meetings, the administrative committee is very interested in understanding how to remove the remaining buildings. So on May 2nd, the administrative committee reviewed the fiscal year 2018-19 CIP, and they recommend that the FORA board approve it, and they reaffirm their transportation and transit project priorities to the board. So then, I'm going to shift gears here and talk about, after the administrative committee's recommendation, we're going to look at why we have a CIP. The CIP is part of the DRIMP requirements. The DRIMP requires that FORA has and maintains a CIP, which is to be updated annually. This requirement you can find in the Base Reuse Plan, Volume 1, page 202. And the second component that the DRIMP requires is that the FORA board review the CIP prior to the fiscal year adoption. Now, we know the fiscal year starts in July. We bring it forward in May for the board to consider adoption. It's provided for you in your report. And the board may provide staff directions on any changes it would like to see, if any. And in June, we look to bring it forward again for a consideration of adoption to have it approved for the next fiscal year. So the capital improvement program is made up of a number of subcomponents. It outlines the improvements in the following key areas: transportation and transit, water augmentation, storm drainage, habitat management, firefighting enhancement, wastewater, water collection, and building removal. This was set out in the base reuse plan. These are the CEQA mitigations that were of prime importance, except for building removal. It's not a CEQA mitigation. And the CIP is updated annually. So I talk a little bit about where we've been and where we're going. So to date, we've been able to retire the stormwater drainage outfalls. We took care of that requirement and finished it. It was about a $2 million project. We took care of the wildfire mitigation project. That was taken care of. We transferred the water and wastewater through various quitclaim deeds and agreements to MCWD. And we've completed several roadway projects. Now, Table 1B in your CIP has a full listing of all the projects that we've completed. And you'll note in there that all the dollar amounts have been updated, so you get an idea of the scope that we've completed. So to date, FORA's completed about $80 million worth of projects. What's remaining? We have a number of transit and transportation projects to complete in the order of $136 million. We've got a water augmentation project that we're working to understand, and we have that to complete at $23 million. The habitat management is well known to everybody, $34 million. And we had two other components that are not CEQA obligations, but are components of the CIP that the board has taken on. And the first is caretaker costs to assist jurisdictions in the maintenance of the former Fort Ord lands as they are waiting to develop them. And then the building removal, which is in the order of $9.5 million. All right. So in the CIP, we have revenues and we have expenditures. This is a really high-level view of the CIP. We're available for any questions, and a lot of it is drawn out in the actual document. We can point to that for reference. But the first area of revenue that we draw money from are the community facilities district fees. The way we get that is we look at the development forecasts, we multiply that times the amount of money per unit, and that gives us how much money we can forecast for that particular year or the out years. 30% of all the CFDs first off the top goes to habitat conservation. And then the remainder, 70%, goes to fund base-wide impact mitigations. It's the transportation, transit, water augmentation, contingencies, et cetera, et cetera. The second source of funds is property tax. That primarily goes to operations, prevailing wage, and caretaker costs. We do about $500,000 a year in caretaker costs that we give back to the jurisdictions. Land sale proceed funds is our third area of revenues. We get that based on where each jurisdiction thinks it's going to sell land. We know that 50% of that comes to the FORA board, and that's used primarily on building removal. And then lastly, our last source of funds is grant funds, and that comes depending on the project that we bring forward if we're able to obtain grant funds for it. So in our expenditures, we discussed that previously. And then we're looking at the development fee. So as I said earlier, we take the developments, we multiply it times a fee number. This is the fee number. In 2010, $46,000 per unit was allocated for the development fee. And to encourage development, the board directed analysis to right-size the development fee. We went through some analysis with a number of consultants. We brought that fee down 27% in 2011, and then looked at the contingencies and reduced the contingencies another 23% in 2013. And then in 2014, we implemented a standard fee calculation, bringing it down further, 17%. So our current, so as of 2015, the fee was $23,000, about 50% of what was in 2010. And then it has slowly increased according to the construction cost index to account for changes over time. And then every 2 years, we have a biennial fee review to bring it back into a line with the original calculation. Last year was a biennial fee review, and this year we're increasing by the construction cost index again. So our current fee per residential unit is $24,621. So changes in the CIP. There have been a series of changes that have happened. A lot of them are errata. These are the key ones that have created shifting in funding. So the first was an update in project plans. We call this a jurisdiction reimbursement plan, mainly because most of the roads are on reimbursement. As Marina completes 8th Street, we reimburse Marina for the completion of 8th Street. That's just a random example. So we've updated the project plans. Again, we talked with the subject matter experts. We understood when they plan on entering into construction, how much they'll need at that time, and we've updated that accordingly. You'll see that again in Table 2. The staff has updated the project budgets based on cost increases over time and internal engineering estimates, and there are two of them that we updated as far as costs. And the first was the Marina Stockade. We have an obligation to take down the Marina Stockade, and that cost increase was an additional $2 million over the original 1996 estimate of $2.2 million. So we finally got a good estimate, and I looked at the cost and updated it. South Boundary Road increased $3.9 million. We increased the transit vehicle purchase by $500,000 this year because it is high on the priority ranking and it serves all jurisdictions. We also increased funding for CEQA planning. There are two roads that are currently starting the CEQA planning. The first is the Del Monte Boulevard extension in Marina. They're planning on entering into a CEQA plan for that. And the second is the Northeast-Southwest connector, formerly Eastside Parkway. Also, another change is we completed reimbursement funding for Crescent Avenue. Upon completion of that funding, we found that we were almost $700,000 lower than the estimate. Marina did a good job as far as the construction on that, and so they've asked to shift that funding over to their other projects per their reimbursement agreement, and most of the funding has gone over to the Del Monte extension project. So the FORA lead projects, this thing really does bounce around, doesn't it? All right. The FORA lead projects. FORA has 3 roadways that are within its responsibility. The first is the Northeast-Southwest connector. As I said, that dotted line is just a general, it might go here. We just started a CEQA process on that, and that process is meant to define an alignment. No one's really sure where that thing's going to go. The 2 roads that we do know about are South Boundary Road and Giggling Road. We completed CEQA in 2010. The FORA board approved the CEQA findings. They approved the project findings. And you've allocated funds for us to go ahead and move forward on this project in the CIP. So we're working on South Boundary Road currently and on Giggling Road. So a little bit on those timelines. The first one, the Northeast-Southwest connector, we're looking to complete the EIR by 2020. South Boundary Road, we are really accelerating the schedule and driving hard on this one. We hope to be done with structural design by the mid of 2018-19 and push into the implementation and actual construction by 2020. We have the funds in hand and we're ready to roll. Giggling Road, we're looking to complete the structural design. One of the challenges with Giggling has to do with the shifting of all the utilities that go through there. There's not only electric utilities, if you've driven down the road you see all the lines, but there's also communication utilities because the DoD is a major communication hub. Everything else on the CIP are reimbursement, which basically means when they complete the project, they invoice us, we provide them with funds. So the building removal obligation is separate from the transportation. We've got 4 major obligations. The first one is East Garrison. We've completed that. The second was Dunes on Monterey Bay. That's partially complete. We've paid some cash, we've given some credit, and there's more credit remaining. Seaside Surplus 2, the budget currently is $5.5 million. We've completed $500,000 of that through various industrial hygienist testing. The same on the Marina Stockade, 4.2, that's the new number, and we've completed $190,000 on that. So we plan on being into construction on Surplus 2 in July, and Marina Stockade will be following shortly after that. We look to have both of those building sites down and completed by mid-2019, 2020. So our recommendation to you after a long presentation is that you receive a report and provide direction to staff and consider adoption of the fiscal year 18-19 CIP. The Administrative Committee has recommended adoption and reaffirms their commitment to the transportation priorities. I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Peter. It's a lot of information. Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Peter. It was a great presentation. I love numbers in this. I can understand numbers. I can't understand a couple of other things, though, so I wanted to just ask you. I think the second to last slide, you had a figure in for building removal, and I think it was, probably just like a comment that you had said that was take down as much as possible. I believe it's the next slide. Yeah, the second one, Surplus 2 area, remove as much as possible with the amount of money. Will there be any sort of prioritization around which areas will have the buildings removed?
Seaside has requested that we remove there's 2 small buildings up on the CSUMB, it abuts the CSUMB property.
Is that the Hammerheads?
No.
It's across the street from the Hammerheads.
Okay.
They're really small buildings, and they are next to a site that CSUMB is looking to develop for a charter school. So Seaside has requested we take those 2 buildings down first. And then the remainder of the buildings primarily fall to the large 3-story concrete barracks buildings. The Hammerheads are not included in this $5.5 million estimate at the time. There is a discussion about funding the Hammerheads going on, and that's something that that has been requested for the Administrative Committee in June.
Okay, and then the last question that I have is under the projects for the East Side Parkway. It shows $560,000 for 2018-19. Is that for CEQA then?
That's correct. That is the board has approved contracts with Whitson Engineers and DD&A, Denise Duffy and Associates. Both of those are currently going through a planning process under direction of FORA staff, and that funding is meant to work towards the completion of an EIR over the next 2 years.
So I'm not terribly familiar with how CEQA works, but does that mean then that they will do CEQA on the one that's projected that shows it cutting through CSUMB?
So the general process, we actually have our CEQA consultant here if she'd be willing to discuss it. We'll go ahead and bring Aaron up.
Well, just briefly, in terms of the CEQA process, I think the last time I saw you all was when we approved the goals and objectives for the project, and we are now in the process of developing an alternatives matrix to look at the various alignment alternatives that might be feasible and meeting those goals and objectives that you approve. So we're in the process of doing that, and once we have a proposed project to bring forward, we will issue the notice of preparation and solicit public input again on the proposed alignment and alternatives and the scope of the study. So that's our next step.
So then will it come back to the board for review or decision as far as the options that you'll be providing then? Is that how it works?
Not the options. when we come back to you, we will have a final EIR for you to certify and a project to certify. And there are many, many, many steps in between now and then, including, of course, the draft public document going out for environmental review or public review. And you all will have a chance to provide comment on that too.
Good.
But not
Okay.
in the board setting.
Good.
Okay.
And that timing on that will be?
I don't know. I really would like to get the NOP out next month. That's what I'd like to do.
Okay. Thank you very much for your
Okay,
help.
thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Aaron.
Ms. Parker and then Ms. Amadeo.
So actually now I have a question about the CEQA process again for the formerly known as Eastside Parkway. So you said that it sounds like there'll be something of a public notice and process in order to determine what the project is that goes into the notice of preparation? Was
Yes,
that?
and Sherry reminded me I forgot to say my name. I'm Erin Harwing with Denise Duffin Associates, for those that don't know me. Yes, so what we heard from the board and the public was that they really wanted to participate in the alternatives and really get their hands on the maps. So in concert with the notice of preparation, the scoping meeting where we solicit input and comments on the actual analysis, we're going to also get that hands-on design charrette, looking at different alternatives and get the public involved in that and have a real solid community workshop on that approach.
Okay, great, thank you. And so that will be in the next month or so?
I'm really hoping
Next few
so.
weeks, but not as part of a FORA board meeting. It would be an other public process, public setting.
I would say it would be separate from a board meeting. Sherry says yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Great,
All right.
thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. So then, I had a question about, not on your area now, back to the CIP. So costs on the South Boundary Road, I know we submitted some questions, but I'm really not clear on the answers. So the South Boundary Road went from a $3.5 million project to now a $7 or $7.5 million. You mentioned up there that the cost went up, but to double in price, I mean, what happened there?
There's been a number of changes that have happened over time, not to the road design, but just simply to the construction cost index increasing, to the fact that the schedule keeps compressing. As the schedule compresses, cost goes up. There have been a whole number of elements, including the history. I think Michael Hulemard has a better understanding of the history, or rather could better explain it.
There is a historical context for these. So many moons ago, when I first started, the Fort Ord Reuse Authority adopted the Development Resource Management Plan. Several people have told me using this term DRIMP makes me look like one. So I'll try not to use DRIMP today. But the Development Resource Management Plan outlined specific items that we were required to do, including a shared responsibility for the regional transportation. FORA had a dollar amount share of that regional transportation. That's carried forward. The CEQA action said that's your mitigation requirement. It was aligned in the original documents, the Development Resource Management Plan and the Base Reuse Plan, as some projects on the base and some regional projects as well, shared responsibility. That's how we operated from 1997 until 2005, when TAMSI undertook a fee reallocation study realigning how that worked, which is keeping the dollar amount the same, but putting dollars on Fort Ord to finish projects and to completely fund them so that they would be up and operating as a network, and that to fund regional projects later, since the regional projects were multiple years out before the remainder of the funding could be applied, and FORA share only being, in some cases, 8 or 9 or 10% of the total dollar amount. And then there was an affirmation of that again later in, I believe, 2010, 2011. So some projects on Fort Ord became a total FORA obligation. Some projects we had already funded portions of, like 2nd Avenue. We the portion we did was from Imgen to Light Fighter, but not beyond. That's why when you drive in here, it stops, as an example. Imgen Parkway is another example. We only did 2-lane to a certain part. We ran out of money. In fact, we went over a dollar amount on that early on when we did this. Since that time, it's been our obligation to fully fund the projects on Fort Ord. It's supposed to reduce our obligation off base. When TAMC did its fee reallocation study this year, that didn't really get applied. So we're not really sure how that's going to work for future, but we'll hold that off and give that to the Transition Advisory Committee. So, costs, since the original projections for this property included things like water, sewer, and other kinds of things, but they were at costs that didn't take into account the elevation that's occurred in the last 4 years in the base cost for things we need for roads, out of China or out of other places. And so that's been a very heavy cost factor. And Peter, correct me if I'm wrong on this, we have also found that there are several other factors in this where multiple projects are being incorporated so that the total cost is in multiple lines.
That's correct.
So all of those factors have affected this cost. And it's not quite a doubling in cost, but it is a $3 million cost. It's a significant difference. So our estimates from 6, 7, 8 years ago when we originally did this, 2010, were at a different number. And even though they've been elevated by a certain percentage, that didn't take into account the special cost factor changes of the products that have to go into the South Boundary Road.
3.5 was from the 2005 study.
Yes. So we're really talking quite a significant change over time. So we're talking about a 13-year difference. And so Peter's looked at a number of estimates and a number of other costs, and we've even had some internal draft cost figures that we have that have helped us to try to derive this, but we think a better cost number is about 7 million plus versus 3.5.
Thank you. So then I have another question that has to do with the project costs on multiple lines. There's now a $1 million cost for an intersection at General Jim Moore and South Boundary Road. It seems to indicate here, and I think staff responded to my question saying that it's part of the General Jim Moore project, but for as long as I've been here, General Jim Moore I thought was complete, and it's actually shown as complete and finished on the Figure 1 map in the CIP. So I'm just a little confused as to how this popped up as a further expense here for the South Boundary Road.
That's correct. The General Jim Moore, the straightaway length is complete. The intersection at South Boundary Road is not complete because South Boundary Road has not been built. The EIS for the General Jim Moore includes the South Boundary Road intersection. And the reason why the cost is split onto 2 lines is one line takes care of the intersection, the other takes care of the roadway elements. So at an intersection, not only do you put in an intersection, you also have to adjust the approach on both sides of the intersection. So the $1 million cost in the General Jim Moore Road is to address essentially the approaches on both sides of General Jim Moore at the intersection.
Okay, and then the other my other question is, so of the $7.5 million South Boundary straightaway project, we've got over $5 million in this next fiscal year. Do we really think we can spend $5.5 million in 1 year? I mean, it looked as though there was, still engineering and stuff that needed to happen.
Yes, I do. Primarily because the South Boundary Road project needs to be fully funded, and that funding needs to be allocated prior to construction.
Well, and I would just say I would hope that it would be possible if for some reason this speeded up process doesn't actually end up with $5.5 million spent, that money could be allocated then, maybe split between Davis Road, which was supposed to be fully funded and allocated in 2012, and the Del Monte Boulevard extension, as an option if it isn't fully spent in this year, that we could allocate the money that way. I'd appreciate that consideration.
Any other questions for staff? Ms. Amadeo.
My question regards the Del Monte Boulevard extension, which I actually have always thought of as the Second Avenue extension because almost all of it is on the former Fort Ord. So I was surprised to see it written as Del Monte. But my first question is, I'm assuming based on answers regarding the other roadways that have been mentioned, especially the north-south or northeast-southwest, formerly known as East Side Parkway, that for the Del Monte Boulevard extension, money spent this year is also for the CEQA process? Mm-hmm. Okay. And is it anticipated that it will be completed in 2022, 2023? Is that?
That is in talking with Brian McMinn, the Public Works Director at Marina, he believes that is the possible plan for it. In going through the CEQA process, he won't be able to develop a real full plan until the process is complete. But he believes as a professional with his expert judgment that it could be completed by that time.
Okay. And my only other question is, what was the criteria that was used by the outside consulting agency that determined the priorities? And I ask this simply based on Del Monte extension, in that we have only one connector between Central Marina and South Marina, former Fort Ord, that's California Avenue. And for public safety reasons, that Del Monte extension becomes critical. Our response times, we learned in our recent budget meeting, have reached almost 9 minutes to get to South Marina. People die in less time than that. So I wondered what the criteria was used to make that determination of where these fit into the process.
So I hear a number of questions being asked, and let me see if I can clarify the first one, which was, I believe, how did we put the Del Monte extension onto the FORA CIP? That was done in conjunction with TAMC and with Marina. There was a discussion.
I actually didn't ask that.
Okay. So to finish answering my question, there was a discussion with TAMC last year to include it. We recognized that it was a necessary part of the roadway. As far as the priority ranking in the allocation process, that was not done by an outside consultant. That was done by a team of the various professionals in the region, including Brian McMinn of Marina, Elizabeth Carricker was involved, Anya Spear from CSUMB, Rick Riedel was there, Enrique Savadera from the county was there. Everyone was there, and we went through a very particular process. I include the priority slides here because invariably this question comes up. And this is our evidence-based ranking process. Now, it's a lot. That's one of the reasons I don't really go through it is because there's a lot of numbers. And when I said there was 160 point of analysis, I kind of meant it. But this is what we go through. The first step is that the administrative committee sets a weighting as to which criteria are important. Now, all of the criteria are important, but they believe that this first criteria of being able to be completed by the time to complete the mitigation for the reuse plan is very important, and they believe jurisdictional equity is also very important. Of the criteria, the administrative committee felt that the lowest of the criteria was, can it be completed by 2020? So we set a weighting process first. Then we go through, and on each roadway for each criteria, we rank them on a scale of 1 to 5, and we have to come to consensus. So what happens is that everyone in the room that I had named earlier comes to consensus. We then multiply the numbers here in the table, and you get a score, okay? This is so you can read it. Thank you. This is the current ranking of the roadways. So Eastside Parkway, the board has set Eastside Parkway and South Boundary Road as 1 and 2. These are the scores that we received out of the process. So you can see that each road got a score, and we brought forward this priority ranking as is forward to the administrative committee, and they discussed the various issues surrounding the roadways because it's more than just technical. There are political issues involved. At the end of the discussion, they decided to keep the priority ranking the way it was. But that's the process that we go through. It's defined in the Appendix A of your CIP, and we try to keep it as evidence-based as possible because it helps create a baseline that's easy to talk from.
Mr. Rob.
So I really appreciate the question, and I really appreciate seeing this. It would have been nice, I think, helpful had I didn't see this in the packet. But I don't understand why, if the East Side Parkway has a score of 13.6, which by my reckoning should put it at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's at 1. Could you explain that?
I can't explain it, but I want to hand that over to Steve Inslee, who has a better grasp on why that might be.
The short answer is this is just a ranking process. Your administrative committee then sends it back to you with a recommendation. So that current priority listing is a product of a board decision from the past.
Yeah, I think it should also be noted in responding to that, Member Hoffa, that the FORA board established this priority for the northeast, southwest corridor almost a decade ago. Let's call it 8 years ago. That priority has carried forward because it was the remaining link that had no roadway that finished a network. Wherever it's located, it finishes a network. That was the priority that had been established for years. This is a different kind of ranking. It's a different kind of weighting. Second, this board has carried forward an on-base first philosophy to finish what it can that has funding for on base to finish this network. That started in 2005 and is carried forward for 13 years. In fact, it was reaffirmed last summer when the board voted to keep the on-base first policy. And so that's been the cooperation we've had with TAMSI over the years on making that finished. Because in the past, our dollars have been only a portion of off-base roadway improvements, and the other funding for those improvements were not in place. So that's the other part of the reason. So it wasn't, the board did not make this foolish decision to pick something that wasn't a priority for a good reason.
Okay, Ms. Adams.
So thank you. Thanks very much for the clarification. I appreciate that a lot, and I certainly appreciate knowing that the East Side Parkway, or whatever you want to call it, was supposed to be for internal, within FORA, communication, a network. That makes complete sense to me. But what troubles me is that too frequently this board has been quoted as saying that the East Side Parkway will reduce the traffic problems on either Highway 68 and or Highway 1. And, I'm happy to really understand that that was never the intention of any former board that could have voted on this. And I think it's important for us to ensure that the community understands that that is not what that road was ever intended to do. So, I appreciate understanding that now, and I didn't before. So thank you for that.
I don't know if I said that. With all due respect, I believe that TAMSI's data, what they presented here and what they presented to the administrative committee, demonstrates that the connector is, while it's on base, it does reduce the traffic impacts on 68, 1, and the amount of traffic through the campus at CSUMB. Those are the numbers that TAMSI presented to this board. So it wasn't this board, you're correct about that. It was the TAMSI numbers that provided that.
So going back then to how that ended up being number 1, where it should be actually number 6, that doesn't make sense to me. Forgive me, it just doesn't. Perhaps I'm simply not understanding what you're saying, but it doesn't make sense to me.
Okay. Well, the board did decide that was a priority, and that's why it is a priority. And the board also has a priority of on-site first. So that's how it came about. Whether it makes sense to you or not, I can't make any judgment on that.
Thank you.
Smart move.
Yes, Ms.
Okay.
Garfield.
Thank you very much. Just to add a little bit of information for clarification, I had an opportunity to talk to Peter about this weighting and ranking system because it's a great system. But it also came after the prioritization of those two roadways. It's number 1 and 2. This weighting and ranking system is newer. So it wasn't as if it had been done from the beginning and then it was circumvented. The prioritization of those two roads preceded by many years, or several years anyway, this new weighting and ranking system that Peter has described.
But I think it's significant to note that the administrative committee took this problem on about the ranking.
Good point, yeah.
And why was it still ranked this way and why wasn't it, and went through this ranking program, but they reaffirmed the priorities as they've been presented. And that was a lot of work done by our staffs from all the cities and the county to establish the priorities make a recommendation of those priorities to the board, recognizing that the board had already set several priorities as well.
And is that what you said that was done 10 years ago?
No, this was done
this year.
This year and last year.
Okay.
Okay, let me see if I can get someone from this side.
Okay.
Ms. Reimers.
Just as a clarification and observation, it was pointed out to me that another good reason for the 1 and 2 are that the lead agency is FORA. And if you go down the list of the lead agencies, it varies as to who is responsible for the various other road completions. So that, again, just makes sense to me that we prioritize something over which we have some control.
Mr. Moore.
So a question, 2 questions. One about the prior slide. I didn't see, and maybe I just misunderstood the labels there, but was there any consideration, is there a project there for widening Imjin Parkway?
No.
And why is that?
So the history with that, I tried to mention that a little bit earlier. That was a project that predated the on-base first complete the whole project. And by the time we got around to that, City of Marina had included the widening of Imjin Parkway in their capital improvement program.
Okay, so that's why it's not in FORAs.
You're
Right, and then a question and a comment about Table 1B for this item. So I can't quite figure out what is the source or the sources of the funding for the things in the column labeled offset?
It depends. If it is a CAP object, it's coming from development fees. If it's a building removal project, it's coming from land sale.
So it's still money that FORA has to get and spend.
Yes.
So why is it, so the remaining obligation is what we don't have to spend and aren't anticipating to have to spend? Because the next column is remaining obligation. I'm trying to figure out what the difference is between these 2 columns.
All right, so it took me a while to pull up 1B.
Can someone put it up on the screen, please?
I don't have 1B ready to go up on the screen, unfortunately. But
Okay.
It's a little hard to read in the, unless you have an electronic form and can zoom.
So are you requesting on 1B the projects that were completed or the projects that are not completed? Oh.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand the difference between those 2 columns.
Okay, so we have the initial budget. We have how much money has been spent to date. That's the total offsets. You have what's remaining, the difference between the budget and the offsets. And then you have the index on that particular dollar
Okay,
amount.
so total offsets is what's been spent to date. That's all that means, nothing else. Okay, why don't we call it spending to date? Might be a little clearer, I'm sorry. And then the column before that is called FORA Budget 2017-2018. And when I look at a table like this, and there's presumably a summary in this case in that first line of transportation transit projects, I would interpret that to say we're going to spend, we are authorizing, if we approve the CIP, we're authorizing the expenditure of $133,772,000 on transportation and transit obligations in the 2017-28 budget. That would be how I would interpret the meaning of that entry in that cell. But I'm getting the impression that's a wrong interpretation.
I'm sorry, Doctor. It looks like that cell, we didn't catch it, but that cell was a carryover really of the previous table's bottom line. And it looks like the Excel file didn't update.
That could explain it. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Morton, then Ms. Amadeo.
So to the earlier discussion about the priority in the recommendation by a task force that was formed and looked at this and met on May 2nd and April 18th, this board is responsible for making a decision about priorities. It's within our policy discretion, correct?
Yes.
So this board today or any other day could reprioritize these roads, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
I want to make, the task force didn't recommend this. This was the administrative committee.
The admin committee formed a task force.
That's a completely different subject.
Perfect.
All of this is coming
Perfect.
directly from the administrative committee.
Okay, but my questions then replacing the right committee still stand, that this board can
That's
modify it, can rely on this, can do any other. So following up to my colleague, Councilmember Amadeo, now sitting as director here today, at our budget meeting this week, it was brought to our attention by our fire department that the response times to get to the places that they're required to provide services in the former Fort Ord, which includes the CSUMB campus, is 8 minutes and 28 seconds. And that is significantly higher than the national norm. And the fire chief indicated part of that is we have no road access. And safety is something that Director Dennis Alexander brings up over and over to us, and I appreciate that concern, and it rang with me that for us in the city of Marina, Road 6 item, your priority of the 6th, the Del Monte extension, which would allow our fire trucks to come from where our firehouse is, there at Palm and Del Monte, to get to the to CSU campus, to get to the facilities and the new homes we're building, would not have to get on a freeway, get through multiple intersections, come across a difficult intersection at the top of the MGM Bridge. And if the 8th Street connection, which would connect from 2nd Avenue, which has been improved, to the promontory, to where the housing and the students are, where these life-saving emergencies frequently happen is where people are, is that we would be able to reduce the time for services to get there. I'm asking this board to consider and relook at prioritizing when those two roads would be funded, number 6 and number 7, because of the current demand for needs for the public. The other thing that needs to be considered is in 2020, the Presidio of Monterey will remove part of its fire truck services from its premises on the Fort Ord property, moving it to the Presidio to save their costs. And that means that they will not be in a backup position to further assist Marina Fire and Seaside Fire. So for those reasons, those are new factors that exist since these priorities were set in 2009, and even since last year, and this was considered. And I doubt that this was considered even at the admin level, and I would like everybody here to give that consideration, maybe take the time to look at these should be reprioritized. The other question that I had some questions in the presentation, is that South Boundary Road has gone up from 3.5 million to 8.5 million if you include the intersection, or 7.5 million if you don't. would it be fair to indicate that our other estimates of costs that are on this CIP budget may be largely underestimated? Who's going to answer?
I'll let Peter do that, but
Okay.
it really depends on when the estimates were done.
Okay.
So some, like the Del Monte project that wasn't on here before, probably has more current estimate, whereas the others that you mentioned had been here for a while and hadn't gone through that whole process. Peter?
Yeah, it's very key on the time and where you are at in the process. So for instance, with South Boundary Road, we have 60% drawings. That means the drawings are at a sufficient level to get some information off of, because you know where you're going to go with that road. And so your estimates for that are going to be a lot more accurate than, say, for Del Monte Extension. Del Monte Extension hasn't even started the CEQA process, so we don't even know what the alignment's going to be, how many lanes it's going to be, how thick the gravel base is, so we can't even estimate what the cost is accurately. So we get those numbers from TAMC. TAMC basically looks at the total on-base obligation and does a nexus analysis and says, here's what we think they could possibly be. And so it's the 2017 fee reallocation study that sets the estimated budget for those roadways that have not started the CEQA process.
Okay, so the concern that I'm having is that in the task force, it's been brought to our attention that when FORA sunsets in 2020, the total demand on our CIP to fulfill our functions will end up with $179 million. And in the task force, we're indicating at full build-out, our CFD, which you just went through the reduction from 46,000 to 23,000, would generate 116 million. So we're at a deficit of 63 million using these numbers, which might even be a greater. To the extent that FORA does its on-site roads and what we do accomplish in by 2020, the concern that I have is, where is the reimbursement going to come to when you indicate that we have 3 road responsibilities, FORA, and the rest are reimbursements? So if we're short 63 million or more, and our land sale revenues are 0 in our budgets currently, and maybe 0 for a great deal of time, where's the funding for the reimbursements for Davis Road, 8th Street, Del Monte? I don't know what road you have. I can't use you. South Boundary, you might be done. But where did those come from?
Well, again, the land sales revenue is not applicable to these mitigations. That comes out of the developer fees. So to the extent that a replacement developer fee structure comes in after 2020, you'll have the funds.
So for our city, we won't have any projects after 2020. So I don't know how many projects the county will have, but the question, that's part of my reason in objection to the earlier budget, is that we need to start putting more of our taxes to fulfilling these obligations, to having the funds available so that the county gets its 9 million, 10 million. Debbie Hale's TAMC, she's not here today, gets its 35 million. That there's money for Seaside to finish what it needs to do at the Fremont-Monterey interchange. And I think part of that is really taking a look at and restructuring and looking at these priorities. The other thing is, of course, we have nothing in here for building removal, which is part of the CIP. And I understand there was a discussion about a bonding mechanism. Something is being circulated at staff level or admin committee level. Would that be appropriate to look at and consider before we adopt a CIP budget?
There are a lot of questions in that.
There are.
With respect to the last one, which is clearly the information that's being assembled by the administrative committee. Task force did it work, brought it back to the administrative committee. They like that. They want to chew on that for a while. They don't think it's ready for this board to review. The CIP looks at the next 2 years. In the next 2 years, we do have building removal dollars, both for the stockade and surplus 2. What happens post-2020 is a matter of the Transition Advisory Committee to look at, and the transition plan will designate. So that's separate from what we do in the CIP, in my opinion. But to the extent we
Trying to
don't
figure that out.
conflate between the two,
Okay.
I think it's better for the board. So I want to help the board focus on which one, and if we can, we'll do whatever. But if you look at this, you'll notice in your ranking discussion, just so it's obvious, we're recommending the coming year all the funding we could possibly spend on Del Monte anyway, even though it's not number one. So that's what staff is recommending. I just want to be aware that it's recommended in here for funding to start the process on the Del
But not
Monte
8th Street.
slide, as an example.
Okay, Ms. Amadeo.
I do have one more question regarding Del Monte, and I do understand that it's being funded in the coming year and for the next few years.
Oh, I'm sorry. Throw the pen at me or something. I'm getting a lot from this side.
It's on Table 1A, Del Monte Extension is listed as an off-site improvement. Almost all of the Del Monte Extension is on the former Fort Ord. I actually believe this is on the wrong, is listed in the wrong category. It should be on-site improvements. I think it creates a better understanding of where this is located. It's only got about 100 feet that's actually in Old Marina. That's right, in our core. The rest of it is on Fort Ord, and I think it makes it a truer statement about the importance of Del Monte Extension, not just to the city of Marina, but to the entire region. This is an important connector, both for public safety and for Marina not being a totally divided community. Because right now we are absolutely a divided community. One side is growing, and the other side, a lot of people south of us don't even know we exist. So, so there's a factor to then putting it even more so that the Del Monte Extension, which is really 2nd Avenue, is listed in the wrong spot, and it should be changed.
I think you addressed it already, but go ahead and do it again.
Staff agrees.
Thank you.
Dr. Ochoa, thank you for your patience.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a point, which, I mean, if my point is correct, I think it could help redirect a lot of the conversation we've had. It appears to me, in looking at this table too, that the priority ranking is somewhat symbolic, and that it's instead being interpreted as a sequence of projects. But if you actually look at the completion dates of each of these projects, as evidenced by the year in which the last installment of money is spent, it bears no relationship to the priority list. So some things that are fairly low in the priority are going to be completed earlier than things that are at the very top. The former East Side Parkway wouldn't be finished, according to this, until 2025. So I think if we're interpreting the priority ranking as what's going to get done first, we're sort of going down the wrong path. I just thought I'd point that out.
I want to take a minute to talk about the public safety aspect of the winding down of the fire station on the former Fort Ord. I do know that Colonel Brown did convene a fire summit where all the chiefs came together and talked about that issue. Marina and Seaside at one time we're going to have a combined fire force that did not work out. But what they're talking about is a multi-agency facility where the Army Seaside Marina can operate out of, that's closer to everybody, and there will be mutual aid coming out of that station. So that in itself is in the works. So while 2020 is near, but it's not here. So the the administrative committee and former boards have spent a lot of time on these capital improvement projects and the priority setting of these projects. We are close to the end of this whole process. The administrative committee reaffirmed their stand on these, and they really had, you know, they took a lot of time with this. And we've taken a lot of time with this in earlier years and even last year and this year. So I'm really in favor of this prioritization. If there was a discussion to move 8th Street and Del Monte Extension up, then and call them on-site, then move South Davis Road down. It's about the same amount of money. When you talk about South Boundary Road, you're talking about direct impact on Del Monte, on Del Rey Oaks and Monterey. And they really have a lot to say about that. I mean, they've been quiet today, but that's a big deal for them. No, the South Boundary Road is critical to their developments. And it's further along. It's been through CEQA. So it doesn't make sense to jettison that one. Well, I heard say, well, let's take the money from South Boundary and put it over on Del Monte. Well, anyways, so that's my thinking on this. I'm going to go ahead and open. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Oh, I'm ready to make a motion as soon as you.
I need to open it to the public.
All right, then I'm ready to make a motion.
Okay, let's open it to the public.
Fred Muir, a couple of things. First, the question about the road networks, being an internal road network and providing improvements on other off-base roads is not contradictory in any way. They can do both and do both. I would like to remind you that at your very last meeting, I think it was one of the few times you were unanimous, everybody said workforce housing was the most important thing we could do at Fort Ord. I think that's what I heard. The infrastructure program, the public works program that has been recommended to you takes care of developing the road network inside Fort Ord, the water improvements that need to be done to actually recognize the infrastructure capability to support those houses. I guarantee you, if you do not build that infrastructure first, as was in the original plan, you will have a line of people up here telling you why you cannot build the houses because you don't have the infrastructure of roads and water. From the get-go, the priority was to build the infrastructure to support the housing as opposed to the way it's normally been done in our region, where you build the housing, create the transportation crisis, and then complain about traffic jams. This board or your predecessors tried to avoid that by a very rational capital improvement program and its sequencing, and that is what has been brought to you. You're about this far from the end game and being able to do the crux of it. Is there more to be done? Absolutely, because of the sins of past governments not requiring the developers to fully carry the cost of their development. So please don't make that mistake. There are ways that you could, I'll call it, increase the flow of money available for this infrastructure, and that's to change the ending date of FORA so you can capitalize on the full range of revenue sources that you currently have now.
Thank you. Public comment still open?
Rula Febronus. I have lived in Seaside for about the last 30 years and seen many changes. There's one comment and one question. The first comment is that in Seaside we had a project called Monterey Downs, and the city said that Monterey Downs should be developed. And city council changed, and the development slowly went down, and public comment started to grow. No Monterey Downs, no horse racing. More and more and more public comment. Finally, there was no Monterey Downs 6 years later. So my bottom line question here is on the East Side Parkway. Just because you have decided at one point that that was in the plan doesn't mean you have to stick to it. Public comment has been here over and over and over again. We don't want East Side Parkway. You can rename it Northwest East Side Corridor, whatever, a corridor, another parkway, doesn't matter. The fact is that just because you rename it, and just because of the fact that you're sticking to your guns, whether it's a court case, whether TAMC says, well, maybe it could help a little bit, it doesn't really matter. The public has been here in numerous times to tell you we don't want East Side Parkway. So really don't make that a priority. That's my first concern and my comment. My question is, I received a letter from Landwatch, and they said that the East Side Parkway currently in your paperwork is listed as between $19 and $40 million. Please answer me that question, someone. Where does that $19 to $40 million going to come from? Is that really a fact? Please let me know. Thank you.
George Riley. I only had a simple question, which was the column that has the costs. It's called obligation. And I understand the word obligation mean it's required.
Which table?
I'm looking at your table 2, which is the big list of all the capital improvement projects, 1 through 19. Mm-hmm. It's probably not this one, but that probably has.
I don't have that table for the PowerPoint.
It's the budget.
Page 81.
Okay, it's table 2. It's the rankings. Okay. Yes, 81. I'm sorry. My question had to do with obligation. What does that mean? Is it an obligation based on a decision that was made in the base for use plan? Is it based on any update of what's considered obligation? Or is it discretionary? Or what? Because I just get confused when the title is obligation and it looks like you're required, but you go down the list and some projects hardly have any money at all except out 10 or 15 years from now. What does that mean? I don't understand what obligation means.
Hello, my name is Paula Duncan Adams. I live on Coe Avenue in Seaside, and I wanted to basically say that I understand that bureaucracy is slower than lava. However, from the budget, it seems to take more sacrifice. But I think that maybe we should slow down a bit on the former East Side Parkway, whatever the former roadway, East Side Parkway. I would like to kind of pause on that for a minute. We have, at Seaside, we are probably the most affected by this particular project. And we have turnover in administration coming up in November. I would like to make everyone aware of that, if you're not, that we have a council member that is up for re-election and another one that is giving up seat. And there is a mayor that is retiring at this point too. So it is a complete slate here that we're going through. And I think that you should give them the consideration of starting the project during their time, because they need that too. Personally, what I think is I'm very concerned about the fact that I don't see any connection to Highway 1. I think that they're going to go through Coe Avenue, and that is going to be a problem. There are 4 schools that will be affected by that. There is Seaside Middle School, which is formerly known as Fitch. There is a charter school there. Further down, there is at Hayes, there is Continuation High School, and the high school is at the end of the roadway over there on Monterey Road. And I think that without a plan, without an effective plan, you're going to create a lot of problems for those people living there. Thank you.
Gary Curcio, Monterey County Hospitality Association. I'm the Director of Government Affairs. It seems to me that there is a process going on right now that this board voted to approve to follow on. And that process is taking place currently. It took 2 months to get it through, but it's still moving forward. What I'm hearing with a lot of this discussion today, it seems to me that it's a poorly veiled attempt to kill this East Side Parkway. But the East Side Parkway has not been approved. It is in a process. Can this board not continue to let this process play out? Because, and with all respect to the prior speaker, yes, there have been a lot of folks speaking against the East Side Parkway. But let's get back to what it was all about. And Mr. Muir is absolutely correct. We're supposed to continually keep our eye on the ball of affordable workforce housing for hospitality and agriculture. The logical place, as it has been for years, to build this housing is on the Fort Ord reuse property. It's part of the plan. Without the infrastructure, it can't happen. So I would urge this board to please take a breath, allow this process to play out. This board voted to do so, and it should be given the opportunity to do just that. Thank you.
Any more public comment? Okay, bringing it back. Do you want to answer those questions, please?
Of the 5 comments, I heard 2 questions. One had to do with the range of 19 to 40 million. There was a quote from a private entity's website about that, so I'm not sure exactly why they use those numbers. But for us, we know that the connector road is going to be a full range from, I don't know what millions, to another plus millions, but it's all going to be predicated on what that roadway would look like, how much is going to be included in trails, what kind of culverts have to be done to handle California tiger salamander, where the placement of the road is, which we don't know yet. So there's a full range of potential where this connector that links Seaside to Salinas or whatever happens is going to be a full range of what that's going to produce. That hasn't been decided. That's a community discussion that Aaron Harway eloquently talked about earlier. Is going to be a part of the process after the notice is submitted. So what the range is, it might be 40 million. It might be somewhat significantly less if it's one lane in either direction, and that provides the appropriate connector, and it also environmentally reduces the impact on the salamander, the aniella, the spine flower, and the other environmental issues that we have to address. So be it. If it's 2 lanes in either direction in order to meet all of the warrants, and that's what's required because that's what the public desires, it's going to be more expensive. So it's the amount of concrete, the amount of asphalt, what the locations are, the cut and fill, and the environmental conditions and what you have to do to build the road. So it could be as much as a range in that area. I don't know, I don't want to use that number per se, but it could be a pretty big range. I did have a second question, and that was about obligation, George. I think you mentioned that, and the term obligation has been used from the beginning. It means it's consistent with what happened in the Development Resource Management Plan. We're not using that other term, but it specifically talks about the dollar amounts in the transportation program and in other programs. It's not just transportation, it's transit, it's also the wildfire. There is an obligation and a dollar amount that FORA shares in the regional cost. So what was that number? It's been adjusted yearly for the engineering news records so that we keep in line with all of that. The Sierra Club made sure that we keep our fees consistent with that so that we are producing the dollars that mitigate our impacts on the environment. And so there's an escalator clause. We've dropped it a couple of times, but still been able to prove we can pay for those obligations. That's how the term obligation came up.
Mr. Chair, could I ask?
Ms. Reimer had the floor when I
sorry.
Okay. Before I make my motion, I just want to make the observation that we did get the information about the Department of Defense and the funding that they are considering, and might be something that we would be looking into. And now my motion simply will be that I move that we accept the capital improvement program as outlined in numbers 1 and 2.
Mr. Chair, I would like to make an alternate motion approving the CIP as proposed with an amendment to the transportation network, prioritizing consistent with the scored ranking of the administrative committee.
I'll second that.
Yes, ma'am. Can't hear you.
If you could please give me the protocol. I don't understand when I would be able to ask a question to understand the motion. The second motion?
Yeah, the second motion is we're going to discuss now. So
Okay.
now's the time. Yeah, now that it has a second, you can.
Okay. So my understanding from what you said was that you want to undo prior ranking and rank them as this scoring. And what Peter described is that the funding practice of how things were funded has to do with funding their need at the time. And it is not fund the first one, then fund the second one, then fund the third one. So your motion doesn't describe how the process would work in your expectation for how things would then be funded based on that. Because, for instance, we have things that rank fairly high for what good they would do, but haven't even started a CEQA process. So funding them wouldn't do anything. It would, and so I'm asking for a clarification as how you would envision this coming into a budget from what your expectation is.
Would you like me to answer that?
Yeah.
Okay. So the way that I see it is our job is to set priorities and to send a direction to our staff. So we would be sending a direction to staff that as they work out this budget and come back to it, come back to us with it, that it should reflect that priority. And I frankly don't find the idea that 10 years ago, a road at that time called the East Side Road and now called, I don't even know what it's called, was called the East Side Parkway for a while, that somehow because boards in the past prioritized that high, that even though our expert staff, following a prioritization process that our staff described as very fair and very thoughtful, would push a project that's sixth in that ranking process up to number 1. We've heard our staff say we're pushing it really hard. We don't even know where it's going. And we don't even know where it's going. How can we possibly be, by 2020, done with the CEQA process? We don't even know where it's going yet. So to me, we've put that cart way in front for political reasons. And I think our staff, our planning staff, recognize that, and it's reflected in the prioritization.
Mayor Gunther.
I have a question, and this is for the people in Marina to think about. I've looked at this list, and based on the information he just gave, we have no business working on Del Monte Avenue or 8th Street. They'll be too far down on the list. So if we go with just the ranking, you're out. So you better call the Army and borrow their Firehouse, because based on this information, it won't happen until 2024. So that is my concern about this. So I'm going to vote no on Alan's motion based on the fact that I believe this is just a motion to move this forward, and there's going to be major more discussions as to what we invest in roads. And I will use Mary Adams' statement at the Board of Supervisors. She told me I was wrong a little bit. She's probably right. But she said, our priority should be workforce housing. And if we're going to have that, then we ought to build roads. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And I wanted to ask a question. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And forgive me if I'm coming out of turn here. I completely agree with my friend, Mr. Curcio. it has to be workforce housing. The only way that we're going to get traffic off Highway 68 is build housing for the people who are driving Highway 68 from South County and Salinas into Monterey to work, the workforce for the hospitality industry. So what I wanted to ask, and I don't know if this is even possible, is it possible to take the money that we have right now scheduled to be, for the East Side Parkway and encumber that, but put it aside more or less until we determine where the workforce housing can be built? Because my concern is that it's not going to be houses like we have all of those other houses that are on the former Fort Ord. It's going to have to be a very, very different concept. It's going to have to be a little village that has duplexes and, a lot of different kinds of housing that I think is going to be a challenge to find the spot where we can put it. So if we encumber a road, if we decide this is where this road is going to go, and then we don't even know where the housing's going to be, it doesn't make any sense. Couldn't we just encumber the money to work with the workforce housing, the hospitality workforce housing, and then just move forward with that in mind and not have it linked to some, either going through CSUMB, which is the worst idea in the world, or going through some habitat, which is the second worst idea in the world. But could we not do that? I don't even know, but I'm just asking the question because in my mind, that makes the most sense. Let's build the housing. We can tell the infrastructure, we've got the money for the infrastructure. All we have to do is decide where we're going to put in the housing, and then we'll put in the infrastructure to go with it.
A lot of that housing is going to be built in Seaside. And I know where it's going to be built. It's going to be built on the east side of General Jim Moore. And it's going to be built along Giggling Road. So those two areas are going to be the major housing developments. And what's going on in Marina is the other. The other place where there may be some workforce housing is in Delray Oaks and possibly Monterey, but I think they're mostly going commercial over there. I'm not sure. They may have mixed use. But those are the real only centers that there's going to be any housing built. And they would be well served by a connector road to Salinas. Now,
yeah, that's not
well, it's not only hospitality that works around here. There's people that come from Seaside to Salinas and work every day, my wife being one of them.
But this housing wouldn't be being built
me.
for your wife.
Wait, you're going to tell me what's good for my wife? That's pretty bold.
Forgive me for that. She would not forgive me either.
But
you know what I mean.
Now I lost my train of thought.
Sorry.
Got my wife involved. Oh, my God.
A lovely woman that Gracie is.
Okay. May I make an observation?
Yes, please.
None of these things are going to happen in isolation. All of it's going to happen as a community discussion group. The dotted line through the map we've been told today, if anybody is paying attention to what we've been told today, and I sarcastically begin to wonder, that line is a moving target. We don't know where it's going to go. We do know that we've just learned, and I knew this before too, that projects are on the drawing board for specific areas for housing. So while we're working through this process to connect these dots, we need to work together in a community atmosphere to begin to recognize that we need housing and we need road structures. And some people don't want either, and that's a choice that they can make. But we as a board have a responsibility to begin to address the use plan that's been on the books for years and work out a way that it can be the least impactful to the environment, as Mr. Hulemard said, and the most productive it can be for the community. And that's basically our goal. And this is just one step in being able to continue to discuss that process, as I see it.
Dr. Ochoa and then Mayor Pro Tem Alexander.
So I understand that this prioritization, the prioritization scheme with all the factors is a nice holistic way of understanding the relative importance of the different projects to the overall objectives of the reuse plan. But I'm having trouble understanding what operational impact the prioritization actually has. Because as I went through here, I did a little exercise and I wrote down, each year 2019 as year 1, and then year 2, year 3, going all the way down to 2028 as year 10, and then beyond. And I put next to each of the years when a project would be completed based on the money flows. And it looks to me like our priority 1 won't be completed until 10 other priorities that are lower actually get finished. So if we're thinking of priority as an ordering, that's not what it's doing. It's a much more holistic view of how important it'll be. The fact of the matter is that FORA is responsible for only 6 of these projects as the lead agency, and it is spending money on all 6 starting on year 1. So it's like it's all yes and. It's not a question of which one is going to be done in sequence. They're firing on all cylinders. So I don't quite understand what the operational significance is of settling on a particular prioritization scheme.
Dennis Alexander, and then
Dennis Alexander.
and then me.
Dennis.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question for you, Michael. Because you were here 10 years ago, a lot of us weren't, when this prioritization had been put forth. And my question, and Peter said that there were there's a technical aspect and a political aspect. And is there a gray area, whereas maybe the technical aspect didn't take into consideration the workforce housing, which we all agree is of utmost importance, but the board 10 years ago or whenever decided, well, you know what, that workforce housing is very important. He said Parkway will address that.
Well, clearly from 2005 to 2010, workforce housing was addressed by this board on a regular basis. Congressman Farr made it a point to come and, and express that concern at least once a quarter. That was a part of the priority decision making. And yes, there were some real concerns about finishing a network on the base. That was the principal reason why there was finishing the network had these big projects. And it was also important to be eligible for funding that was coming our way under the ARA program. For those of you that don't remember that, when President Obama first got in office, he created an infrastructure program, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, and under that program, we were able to get millions and millions of dollars of help for projects that had already completed its environmental review and work. So moving the environmental on these projects positions them in a way to be funded. The Del Monte project, for example. The funding is in here to do that project and the environmental over the next 2 years. And as TAMSI has proven to us recently, with I think $19 million on Imjin Parkway, they were able to get in a grant to reduce the city marina developer fee obligation, and then there's another $10 million that was announced in the newspaper today. We're aware that if you can get environmental and have what they call shovel-ready projects set up, whether it's a trail to enjoy the national monument or whether it's the Del Monte project, those are crucial. So what we've invested in the administrative committee is putting dollars where we can position our successors in the best place to be able to finish what was started in '97. So that's how I would answer that, Dennis. That's what happened essentially a decade ago after really being beat up a lot by the congressman to make sure that affordable housing was a top priority. In fact, we modified our master resolution twice to accommodate more affordable housing, and the jurisdictions are doing that throughout the board. And I would add as well, East Garrison's about to do the second phase of Manzanita Place, which is another significant affordable housing that will be right at the end of whatever roadway goes out that section of the base.
Dr. Moore.
So I don't normally weigh in on transportation issues, but this is a fascinating discussion, and I'm hearing maybe an important kind of unresolved issue. I think we can all agree on a couple of things, that there's more affordable housing in Salinas than on the Monterey Peninsula, and as a consequence, there are folks who live in Salinas but work in relatively low-wage hospitality jobs on the Monterey Peninsula. So the original East Side Parkway, if you will, or at least recent descriptions of it that I've heard, have the purpose of increasing the ability to move folks from Salinas, who can afford to live there, to the Monterey Peninsula for their low-wage jobs. But on the other hand, I've just heard discussion about having affordable housing actually built on the Ord community. So if you are building a nexus where folks who work in relatively low-wage jobs on the Monterey Peninsula and no longer have to live in Salinas but can live on the former Fort Ord, if that's what you want to do, then you want to make sure that your priorities here aren't about connecting Salinas better to the Monterey Peninsula, but making absolutely sure that the road network on the Ord community, and Mayor Rubio has just said a lot of this is going to be potentially built in Seaside's portion of the former Fort Ord. Want to make darn sure they can get relatively quickly from there to the rest of the Monterey Peninsula without clogging up all of Seaside's roads or further burdening the section of Highway 1, say from Light Fighter Drive to the north end of Salinas over by Costco. I don't hear a resolution on that in terms of these priorities, so I would certainly urge the board to give that some careful thought going forward.
Okay, Ms. Amadeo and then Ms. Parker.
I appreciate Alan Hoffa's motion. However, I also agree with Dr. Ochoa. When you look at Table 2 in the board packet, it shows the dollar contribution and obligation of FORA to the various projects. And the Northeast-Southwest Connector only has funding in the FORA budget for those first 2 years, and I'm assuming that's the CEQA process, and I'm not sure what the next year is. It may be a continuation of that. It may be other things, but it's not about construction. There you go. It's not about construction. I don't see anything related to construction of Eastside Parkway until at least 2022, whereas the Del Monte extension, and I still want to call that the Second Avenue extension, it begins with its CEQA process also in the coming fiscal year, and it is funded every year for the next 5 years. So it will be completed before the Eastside Parkway or Northeast-Southwest roadway system is. And I would say that that's a good thing. When you talk about affordable housing, on the former Fort Ord, Marina has built affordable housing on 2nd Avenue. That's the extension. We also have Abrams Park, which is filled with affordable housing, and we have affordable housing in Preston Park. That's on top of what we already provide in the core of Marina. So there is a lot of affordable housing within Marina that will benefit from the way this is currently written, including the fact that Eastside Park will at least go through the process of the EIR to see where it needs to be located and how those people that currently live in Abrams, Preston, the low-income housing on 2nd Avenue and the core of Marina, how do they get to their jobs and not have to use Imgen Parkway and Highway 1, and they're not coming from Salinas. They're coming from here. So.
Okay, Ms. Parker and then Ms. Garfield.
Okay, I saw your hand back. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate this discussion because I think it's been a while since we've really tried to grapple with what these priorities are for, and I think we're sort of circling around some of these issues. The prioritization may be a popularity contest, but it isn't necessarily lined up with funding, as Dr. Ochoa has pointed out. And I think, though, the factor that's missing here that I think we need to introduce into the discussion is the necessity to prioritize based on whether development has occurred, so based on existing development rather than future or anticipated. So for instance, and that needs to be combined with, I think, especially at this late stage, the question of when FORA sunsets, how are we doing the financial planning as it relates to the transportation network so that it makes sense post-FORA? So it's sort of a two-part thing. So existing development. The county has a development, East Garrison, and if you haven't been out there, you know, it's quite the thriving community, thousands of residents. We have collected the impact fees as those homes were built. We've collected those impact fees, and that was supposed to go to the Davis Road improvements. But now, according to the recommendation from the admin committee, those monies are going to go to South Boundary Road. Okay. I don't know that there is there's talk of a developer and a deal coming that's been promised before, but it didn't come into being. So the issue of post-FORA really has to do, if we were really doing the planning for existing development, and some of those are going to be on-site roads and some are going to be regional off-site, the post-FORA aspect really has to do with, I think, back to a point that Fred Muir brought up, which is that the developers need to pay the full cost of their impacts. And if we were really thinking about this, we would be estimating how much the developer of the in Delray Oaks and Monterey would contribute to the South Boundary Road construction. We can't go back to East Garrison and ask them for more money, or the developers. So we have to think about where has the money come from, where is it obligated, and for whom? And FORA is not the only entity. So this whole thing of doing local roads first and FORA's obligations first is creating a real problem, because Monterey County has taken on an obligation on behalf of FORA on the Davis Road, was supposed to have the money 5-6 years ago. That hasn't happened. And once FORA goes away, it's not clear where that money can come from, because we can't go back to East Garrison, whereas a developer in Seaside or Delray Oaks, we can estimate how much they might contribute to a road, and then FORA only has to fill in the difference, which brings that obligation down. Anyway, I just wanted to bring those factors, which I think are critical, into the discussion of how we prioritize. And we've been going about this in sort of an automatic way for a number of years, and I think we really need to be looking at the full, the full picture to do it in a way that's responsible.
Mayor?
Yeah, you can't change the horse in midstreams. You can't change the rules. We've been going through 4. We've got 2 years left, so now all of a sudden Delray Oaks' developers are going to pay for the road. All the other jurisdictions early on, the money was put in a pot, was fungible, that was based on priorities established by this board. The money that came from Marina might have gone to Seaside, or Seaside might have gone to CSUMB or whatever else. We can't just say now, oh, okay, everybody else gets theirs. Delray Oaks and Monterey, you're at the end of the, so okay, your developers are going to pay for your road now. It doesn't work that way, and it's totally unfair to us. At one time, South Boundary Road was the top of the CIP. We deferred year after year after year because there were other projects that were willing to go and they were ready to go earlier. We deferred voluntarily. Now we're ready to go, and all of a sudden people are trying to kill that development to hurt Monterey and Seaside and not have a total connection of the road. General J. Moore Boulevard right now dies right at an old rickety piece of quarter-inch thin asphalt. We want to be able to connect that all the way through out on Highway 68 so we have an a good transportation network. So it's primarily transportation network, second of all, development along that line, and go from there. But we've got to stay with the rules the way they were, and the Transition Task Force will determine how the money is allocated or how it goes forward after 2020. So,
Ms. Garfield.
Thank you, Chair. I want to say I appreciate the arguments that are being brought forth, but I really want to take exception to the idea that we're not doing things for the future, that we're only going to support things that already exist. And the phrase I've used before is that we need to make sure that the first movers and the late bloomers are equally and equitably treated. The whole system needs to be supported. And so looking at what already exists is important to be served. Very important to be served, certainly if you're sitting in traffic and you already live on the Fort Ord. But what is going to be is really important. And in the Transition Task Force, one of our goals is to make sure that in July 1, 2020, as much that is as can be is teed up for what's still to come. And sometimes that's not finishing a project, but in the case of a connector road, making sure the EIR is done so we know what the circumstances are and what the funding is. And it may be moving on things that can be moved on, the shovel-ready concept. But I guess I really just want to say very clearly that everyone is served, the whole region and community is served best when everyone is served fairly and equitably. And just because you weren't ready 5 years ago doesn't mean you shouldn't get your due. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna close the discussion on this and call the question because we're starting to repeat ourselves. And I will make one note, and that is that Seaside's development at the Highlands went early, and the tax increment for that paid for a lot of improvements in other places on the base. And that's because it was all for one and one for all. You know, everybody's taking care of everybody. So I'm going to call the question. I'm going to call for the vote on the substitute motion. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Aye. Okay, so that motion dies. Now, on the original motion, a roll call vote. All those in favor?
Can I ask a question on whether there could be a friendly amendment to this motion? So I raised a point before that if for some reason the full $5.2 million that's allocated for this year for South Boundary Road, if that isn't spent, that could be divided between Davis Road and the Second Avenue extension or Del Monte extension.
Do I get to respond to that?
You do. You're the maker of the motion.
I made the motion as I made it, and I will stand for the motion that I made because your question is hypothetical, and I'm not willing to go there.
Thank you. I was willing to support the motion if that could be included as a contingency, but if not,
I don't have enough information to be able to change it. I'm sorry.
Okay, roll call vote, please.
Director Rubio?
Yes.
Director Parker? No. Director Adams? No. Director Phillips?
Yes.
Director Amadeo?
Yeah.
Director Hoffa?
No.
Director Alexander?
Yes.
Director Gunter?
Yes.
Director Reimers?
Yes.
Director Edelin?
Yes.
Director Morton?
No.
Director Carbone?
Yes.
Director Garfield?
Yes.
8 to 5.
8 to 5. Okay, so we'll be talking about this again next month. Oh, there's a motion to adjourn. There's a motion and a second to adjourn. We're not done with the agenda. We have one item left, and I do need a motion to extend the meeting.
So moved.
There's a motion to extend the meeting to time certain 5:30? Will that work?
Yeah.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Yeah, yeah. We already missed the Academies thing with Jimmy, so.
Chair?
Go ahead. Fire it off.
Chair, I would like to point out that the Marina Coast Water budget is a key component on this agenda. The reason being is by contract, the 1998 FA agreement, we have until June to approve that budget. If there's a two-vote process, and this is just a big if there's a two-vote process, and it's not, the first vote's not taken tonight, it'll extend into July, which will thereby cause problems with the agreement. The reason I bring that up is because I thought we were only going to take care of this next item and not the next two. All right. I'll be quick through the water augmentation three-party planning update. We met a number of times. Sorry, it's not that we met a number of times. In 2016, we signed a three-party agreement with MCWD and Monterey One Water to do a planning study, split three ways between the agencies. In January 2017, the Technical Advisory Committee got together, reviewed a scope. We put that out for bid. We got no responses in May 2017. And between June and December, Monterey One Water and MCWD had to renegotiate their pipeline agreement, thereby delaying this particular action. In December 2017, the general managers agreed that it would be fine if MCWD went ahead and was the main contractor for the planning study. And so we're going to go ahead and bring these adjustments here to the board. The essence behind it is that MCWD will be able to prepare a work scope, and that I'm sorry, I got skipped here. The key changes to the contract that we're asking you to approve is that MCWD may act as lead agency to the contract to contract a consultant, that MCWD can invoice each party by 1/3, and that FORA is to approve the work product quality, adherence to work scope, and that errata to bring the various errata to bring the contract up to date. So MCWD in the next step will prepare a scope if approved. The technical advisory group will get together and discuss the work scope. It's to include the economic and feasibility study of water conservation and efficiency, additional pure water, groundwater recharge, desalinization, and other. And then MCWD will select a consultant to prepare the planning study. After the study is complete, we'll bring it back to the board for their consideration. So what we are requesting is that you authorize the executive officer, or what we're recommending is that you authorize the executive officer to execute Amendment 1 to the three-party water augmentation study agreement.
Okay. Any questions for staff? Mr. Moore.
I'd like to move approval of Amendment 1 with two tiny changes. Number 1, in paragraph 4.1.8, to clarify at the end of that sentence that we are talking about invoicing the parties to the agreement as opposed to invoicing contractors who are doing work for us under the agreement. And then throughout to change the acronym PCA to MOW. That's the motion.
I'll second that.
Thank you.
MOW or M1W?
Whatever.
I think it's M1W.
M1W.
I think they use M1W, but
kinda
you can define it however you want in the agreement.
So, yes, ma'am.
I just want to clarify, that doesn't change the final oversight of FORA in this agreement.
No, it doesn't.
No.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there any public comment on this? You're bringing it back? Did we have a motion? Yes. Had a motion in a second? Okay. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Next item, Marina Coast Water District budget. You present this, Tom?
No, I'm getting you both. So, oh, Tom, yeah, you're welcome to.
You're ready.
All right, 1998, the water wastewater facility agreement was put together. That agreement requires that MCWD reports the Ord community revenues and expenses to the Water Wastewater Oversight Committee. That committee reviews the quarterly and annual reports and then reports that to the board. And the FORA board has 3 months from the time of the receipt, March 18th, to adopt by ordinance the compensation plan, which is why I was pushing on it earlier. In January 2018, actually starting earlier in the year, November 2017, MCWD had been discussing with the Water Wastewater Oversight Committee the rate study that they were going through. And they got input from the WWOC, even though this is not the purview of the WWOC. And so they were in good faith coming to the WWC to discuss the methodology and discuss the rationale behind the rate study that was performed and approved by Marina Coast Water District in March. In February, the WWC reviewed the 5-year capital improvement program. They then they approved that. They then received and proposed the Ord Community Budget Compensation Plan. They discussed that on March 28th and April 11th. On April 25th, the committee found the budget to be in order and in accord with standard practices. Their recommendation to the board is adoption of the Ord Community Budget and Compensation Plan with no change to the capital charges. There is a note that the rate study, the 218 rate study that was passed by MCWD, is to pay for capital improvement projects, and there's a list of the capital improvement projects that are included in the 5-year CIP here. They include various roadways. The ground rules generally in the 98 agreement, and the reason we're going over this is just to make sure we're clear what the next steps have to be. If FORA does not respond within 3 months, MCWD's last submitted compensation plan shall be deemed adopted and will roll over to the next year. If the FORA board disputes the budget, they must, 1, identify specific line items for dispute, 2, provide specific reasons for denial, and 3, provide specific remedies. That's part of the 1998 facilities agreement. It's laid out in the contract as to the steps that need to be taken. So with all that really quick background, please consider resolutions adopting a compensation plan for the base-wide water and sewer services on the former Fort Ord, which are attachment A and B. And please note that there have been no changes to the capital surcharges since 2015-2016. Next steps for the WWC in July and August of next year is to review the master plan. And the master plan is a major input into determining the capacity fees from MCWD, and so that will be considered in the next fiscal year. Any questions?
Questions for staff? Any questions from the public? Bring it back to the board. There's a motion and a second to move the staff recommendation on the discussion.
I did have several questions, but in view of the time, I just want to express my concern that the water usage rates being proposed in this, we only see 1 year, but they're quite significant, and I'm not comfortable with that. And one of the major reasons is that existing Ord community users, it looks to me from the CIP, are paying for infrastructure for new development. And in the Bartles Wells report from 2004, a while ago, they made recommendations that said that project costs should be shared only among all future Ord community users, not the existing ones paying for the future ones, and that project costs could be funded by the development being served by the project, and I saw some that looked fairly specific, or bonding for that money. So I just feel that the rates are going up quite a bit, and that is in service of new development, which is not appropriate for existing users. So I'll be voting against the recommendation.
Any other comments on the second? All right, all those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, let's do a roll call.
Chair Rubio, would it be worthwhile to have some information come from our staff on Supervisor Parker's remarks?
Yeah, go ahead. Might enlighten us.
Thank you, Chair Rubio. Keith Vandermont, General Manager, Marina Coast. The rates do not include any paying for any growth. Growth pays for growth. So I think the particular study you're talking about, the South Boundary Road, there's a pipeline in there. That's paid for out of development fees. So our rates do not cover any growth. In fact, they cannot. By Prop 218, they pay for existing CIPs for existing users, for operations and maintenance for existing users. And so that's really how it's set. So I just wanted to clarify that our rates are not paying for any development projects. Those are paid for separately
Could you speak to the 5 wells that are being replaced, not within the 5-year CIP, but I imagine that you're collecting money for the replacement of those wells, and several of them are on the former Fort Ord. So I had a question about those wells, where the replacement wells were going to be in terms of geography and how deep they were going to go, and they seem to be quite expensive at $6.2 million each. There are probably reasons for that, but I just wondered how accurate that was.
Yeah, it's a good question because they are listed in the CIP, but they are listed in the out years. So they're not actually in the budget right now. They're placeholders for future. So within the budget we have and within the rate study, those are outside of that. And so those are originally in past budgets were included because there was the thought that as development was going so quick on the Fort Ord that we may have to do something in those well facilities. But we have learned since then that that's not needed in the time frame that we're looking at. But not to lose sight that in the future that may be a project we have to look at. It's kept in there as in the out years. But those project costs, they're not included in the rates. They're not included in the budget. And so those aren't projects that are moving ahead right now. And the details of location, depth, those sorts of questions would be answered well down the road if and when those are even needed. I don't think, in fact, a lot of that will be needed in next 20, 30 years even. So hopefully that answers your question.
So, I mean, you mentioned that developments are going to be paying for the pipelines that will be serving them. That's not clear in your CIP. So you're saying that the South Boundary Road pipeline, or whatever it was called in another place, will be paid for by the development. The giggling transmission from D Booster to General Jim Moore Boulevard, that also would be paid by developer fees?
So, and I'm not sure of that second one, but I can maybe look at that.
7th Avenue and Giggling Road. I mean, there's a whole series here.
There are. And so the analysis went through and looked at if any of these were due to development. We do collect capacity fees, development fees, if you will, that are separate from what we collect from rates. And so when we go through our projects, we identify which ones are actually to be covered by rates. And so the rates are to cover those CIPs. And then those that are actually development-oriented or capacity-oriented, and our capacity fees cover those. In certain cases, projects actually have a dual benefit. And so in that case, you may have a project that's split between rates and development fees.
And, is there any clue within the 5-year CIP about who's paying for these things? Because they're all listed here. There's a category with some letters. I actually don't have the key to those letters, but you know, it's as a person reading this, it looks to me as though all these things are included, and so
we do have that information.
Okay.
So hopefully, Pierce Rosum, he's with Corello. He did our rate study for our 218 process.
Good afternoon. So just in terms of the legend that you see, a category E is for existing users. So anything that is E is existing, everything else would be development funded, so growth pays for growth.
So S stands for?
S stands for CIP supports a single parcel or owner's project.
Ooh. And M?
Multiple parcels.
Multiple. Got it. Single and multiple. Okay. Well, you know, it'd be helpful to have this information spelled out because, you know, as the only voice for the Ord community, or one of the voices, I guess, the opportunity to really advocate on their behalf, for us to make an informed and responsible decision, we need to know these things. And so I guess I should have asked my questions to begin with, because I think those were the majority of my questions.
So your question about the wells does raise an interesting sort of philosophical issue for us, because arguably existing users are contributing to seawater intrusion, as does the ag industry in the Salinas Valley. So when we replace one of our existing wells on the former Fort Ord, we're doing that for a number of reasons. Part of that may be to get away from the existing seawater intrusion front, and how much of that well cost should be paid for by existing users versus is it producing more water for growth on the Ord community, and of course they should bear that cost. And I'm not sure there's a hard and fast, I'll have to ask Corello offline that question. How do we divide that up? What's the industry standard approach to that? Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, roll call vote, please.
Director Rubio.
Yes.
Director Parker. Director Adams. Oh, Director Phillips is gone. Director Amadeo. Director Hoffa. Director Alexander. Director Gunter. Director Reimers.
Yes.
Director Edelin. Director Morton. Director Carbone. Director, oh, Garfield, sorry.
I have a question too.
Okay, so.
Motion passes,
We'll-
but has to return for second vote next month. It's the June 8th that comes back for a second vote, and that's why Peter pushed for it tonight.
Okay, so, public comment period. Is there any public comment at this time? Oh, yes,
Just
ma'am.
general comment, is that what you're asking? I didn't-
No, public comment.
Public comment, okay.
We'll get public
I thought we
comment.
voted.
Seeing none. Items from members.
Okay, I just have an item, and it may affect somebody else, but I very sadly will not be in town June 8th and would unfortunately miss the workshop, which I would like to not miss, so I just am pointing that out. It may affect other people as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, someone had made a motion for adjournment. Okay. Okay.